In the late 16th century, on the coast of what is now North Carolina, English colonists established a settlement on Roanoke Island with the ambitious goal of creating a permanent foothold in the New World. Yet within a few years, this entire community of over 100 men, women, and children would vanish without explanation, leaving behind only cryptic clues and a mystery that has endured for more than 4 centuries. The colony was founded in 1585 under the patronage of Sir Walter Raleigh, who envisioned English expansion across the Atlantic and sought to establish a strategic military and commercial presence in the Virginia region. And initial efforts showed promise as settlers constructed fortifications, mapped the land, and attempted to document the indigenous peoples and natural resources they encountered. However, the venture quickly deteriorated due to supply shortages, disease, conflict with local Native American tribes, and the sheer difficulty of sustaining a European settlement in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment, which prompted the colonists to make the fateful decision to abandon their efforts and return to England in 1586. Remarkably, Sir Walter Raleigh and the English crown were unwilling to accept this failure, and they authorized a second attempt just 1 year later, in which approximately 119 colonists, including families with children, were transported back to Roanoke Island, with supplies intended to establish a self-sufficient community that could endure the challenges that had defeated their predecessors. The expedition leader, John White, kept detailed records of the settlement's early months and documented what appeared to be a functioning village with organized structures and plans for expansion. Yet when White returned to England to secure additional supplies and recruit more settlers, he found himself unable to arrange a swift return journey due to England's. Between 3000 and 1200 BCE, on the island of Crete, there flourished one of antiquity's most sophisticated civilizations, one whose artistic achievements and architectural innovations would influence the entire Mediterranean world, yet whose sudden collapse remains shrouded in historical ambiguity and scholarly debate. The Minoans, named after the legendary King Minos by modern archaeologists, constructed palatial complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia that rivaled anything produced in the ancient Near East, featuring advanced drainage systems, multi-story structures with sophisticated internal lighting, and elaborate frescoes depicting scenes of daily life, religious ceremony, and natural wonder. Their society developed a complex trade network extending from Egypt to Anatolia, their merchants carrying distinctive pottery and luxury goods across maritime routes, establishing Minoan culture as a dominant force in Bronze Age commerce and diplomacy. Yet remarkably, despite the vast archaeological evidence of their accomplishment, the Minoans effectively vanished from historical consciousness, their civilization transforming from a thriving empire into fragmented settlements and eventually absorbed populations. The mechanism underlying this disappearance appears rooted in a cascade of environmental and cultural catastrophes, beginning with the catastrophic eruption of the Thera volcano around 1600 BCE, which likely triggered tsunamis, ash fall, and climate disruption that destabilized Minoan society and economic systems. Following this geological devastation, successive invasions by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland gradually conquered and absorbed Minoan territories, their culture merging into early Greek civilization in ways that obscured the original Minoan identity and achievements. In the arid deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, there emerged one of history's most sophisticated yet largely forgotten civilizations, the Nabataeans. These remarkable people built an empire not through military conquest, but through extraordinary mastery of trade and water management in one of the world's most inhospitable environments. Centered in what is now southern Jordan with their capital at Petra, the Nabataeans created a network of trading routes that connected Arabia, Egypt, the Mediterranean, and India, moving frankincense, myrrh, and spices across thousands of miles of desert. Their cities rose like mirages in the wasteland, carved directly from rose-colored stone, featuring sophisticated hydraulic systems that captured and stored every precious drop of rainfall. They developed intricate cisterns, dams, and channels that allowed agriculture to flourish where nothing should grow, demonstrating an engineering brilliance that rivaled any contemporary civilization. Yet unlike Rome or Egypt, the Nabataeans succeeded through commerce and innovation rather than military domination, creating a peaceful economic superpower that enriched the ancient world. The psychological mechanism behind their success lay in their understanding that the desert itself could be transformed from a barrier into a highway, that water could be harvested and preserved through patient engineering, and that profit derived from facilitating trade was more sustainable than conquest. They built their wealth on the logical principle that controlling the pathways between great civilizations was more valuable than controlling the civilizations themselves. However, what is remarkable about the Nabataeans is how completely they have vanished from popular historical consciousness, despite their undeniable importance. Around 5,000 years ago, in the fertile plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, there flourished one of humanity's most sophisticated and enigmatic urban societies, a civilization that rivaled ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in complexity, yet left behind mysteries that continue to perplex archaeologists and historians to this day. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan culture, emerged around 2600 BCE and mysteriously vanished by 1900 BCE, leaving behind meticulously planned cities with standardized weights and measures, advanced drainage systems, and a written script that remains undeciphered despite centuries of scholarly effort. At its peak, this civilization spanned an area larger than modern-day Egypt, encompassing sophisticated urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, where citizens lived in brick houses arranged in precise grids, suggesting centralized planning and governance of remarkable sophistication. The psychological mechanism underlying the Indus Valley civilization's success appears rooted in a collective commitment to order and standardization that transcended individual ambition or regional variation, a mindset that prioritized communal infrastructure and public health through advanced sewage systems and public baths over monumental temples or palatial residences of rulers. Yet this very uniformity and lack of obvious hierarchical displays, combined with the complete absence of extensive military fortifications or weaponry, suggests a society fundamentally different from its contemporaries, one perhaps governed by consensus rather than coercion. The civilization's sudden abandonment around 1900 BCE remains contested, with theories ranging from environmental collapse due to shifts in monsoon patterns and river courses to invasions by Indo-Aryan peoples, though evidence for the latter remains circumstantial and debated. Between the 8th and 1st centuries before the Common Era, a sophisticated civilization flourished in central Italy, occupying the region we now call Tuscany, and these people, known as the Etruscans, constructed cities, developed complex religious practices, created remarkable art, and established trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean world. Yet by the 1st century of the Common Era, their distinctive culture had been almost entirely absorbed into the rising Roman civilization, leaving behind only fragments and mysteries that archaeologists continue to puzzle over today. The Etruscans possessed their own language, their own alphabet derived from Greek origins, their own distinctive artistic traditions featuring elaborate bronze work and terracotta sculptures, and their own system of divining the future through the examination of animal entrails, practices that would later influence Roman religious thought and ceremony in ways both direct and subtle. Their cities were remarkably organized urban centers with temples, theaters, and sophisticated drainage systems, suggesting a society with considerable engineering knowledge and administrative capability. Yet the gradual Roman expansion southward and northward from the Latin heartland systematically incorporated Etruscan territories into the growing Roman Republic. The mechanism of their disappearance lay not in catastrophic destruction, but rather in cultural assimilation and political subordination. As the Romans adopted many Etruscan religious practices, architectural styles, and administrative techniques, while simultaneously erasing Etruscan political independence through military conquest and the elevation of Latin culture as the dominant standard for civilization. What remains puzzling about the Etruscans is how completely their written language was abandoned and lost to comprehension, for while scholars can read their alphabet, the meaning of most Etruscan texts remains opaque. In the floodplains of the Mississippi River, near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, there once stood one of the most sophisticated urban centers north of Mexico before European contact, a sprawling metropolis known as Cahokia that housed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants at its peak around the year 1100. This Mississippi culture city rose to prominence during what archaeologists call the Mississippian period, developing an intricate social hierarchy, monumental earthwork construction, and a complex trade network that stretched across much of North America. Yet by the time European explorers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, Cahokia had been completely abandoned for nearly 2 centuries, leaving behind only massive earthen mounds and questions that scholars have struggled to answer for generations. The civilization built approximately 80 mounds, with Monk's Mound being the largest pre-Columbian earthwork north of Mesoamerica, a structure so vast that it covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high, constructed entirely from millions of baskets of earth moved by hand and deposited in calculated layers. The city itself was organized with remarkable urban planning, featuring a grand plaza surrounded by wooden palisades, residential neighborhoods, craft workshops, and agricultural fields that fed the dense population through a sophisticated understanding of the Mississippi's seasonal flooding patterns. Yet despite leaving behind this architectural legacy and evidence of their cultural sophistication, the Mississippian civilization collapsed entirely, and the specific reasons for Cahokia's abandonment remain mysteriously unclear, with scholars proposing multiple overlapping theories including severe droughts lasting decades, resource depletion from overharvesting timber and game, flooding events that disrupted their agricultural base, internal social conflict and warfare, or the loss of it. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the Khmer Empire dominated Southeast Asia as one of the world's most sophisticated and powerful civilizations, controlling vast territories across present-day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, while constructing the magnificent Angkor Wat Temple complex, which remains the largest religious monument ever built and a testament to their architectural and organizational prowess. The empire's decline was not sudden, but rather a gradual erosion of power and influence caused by a confluence of interconnected factors that weakened the state's ability to maintain control over its sprawling territories and populations. Environmental pressures played a critical role, as shifting monsoon patterns and the silting of irrigation systems that had sustained the empire's agricultural foundation made it increasingly difficult to feed the growing population and generate the surplus wealth necessary to fund their enormous construction projects and military forces. Simultaneously, the rise of neighboring Thai and Vietnamese kingdoms began to encroach upon Khmer territory, fragmenting the political unity that had once bound the empire together under centralized rule. The capital of Angkor was gradually abandoned over the course of several centuries as the center of power shifted southward to Phnom Penh, and what was once the world's largest city slowly disappeared into the jungle, its temples and palaces consumed by vegetation and eventually forgotten by the outside world until French explorers rediscovered the ruins in the 19th century. The paradox of the Khmer Empire lies in how a civilization capable of engineering such monumental achievements, demonstrating mastery over water systems, mathematics, astronomy, and urban planning on an unprecedented scale, ultimately proved unable to adapt when the environmental and political circumstances that sustained it fundamentally transformed. In the heart of southern Africa, among the granite hills of present-day Zimbabwe, rose one of the most magnificent stone civilizations the medieval world had ever witnessed, a sprawling metropolis that would eventually vanish from memory so completely that European explorers centuries later refused to believe Africans could have built it. Great Zimbabwe emerged around the 11th century as a trading hub for the Shona people, growing to house between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants at its peak in the 15th century. With its iconic stone structures arranged across nearly 1,800 acres of carefully planned architecture that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of engineering, urban design, and social organization. The civilization's wealth came from trade in gold, ivory, and copper, with merchants traveling along Indian Ocean routes to exchange these precious commodities for silk, porcelain, and beads from distant lands, creating a cosmopolitan center where Arab traders, Asian merchants, and African communities mingled in thriving marketplaces. Yet by the 17th century, this magnificent civilization had abandoned its stone city entirely, leaving behind only ruins and the question of why such a successful metropolis would be so thoroughly deserted. Scholars now understand that a combination of environmental degradation, particularly severe droughts that depleted agricultural resources and made sustaining such a large population impossible, coupled with the shifting of trade routes away from the region as Portuguese colonial expansion altered Indian Ocean commerce, created unsustainable conditions that gradually forced the population to disperse into smaller settlements and eventually fade from historical prominence. What persists as remarkable, however, is how completely great Zimbabwe disappeared from global consciousness despite its extraordinary achievements, how its architectural legacy was denied to its own creators. Between approximately 1500 and 400 BCE, across the steaming jungles and coastal plains of Mesoamerica, there flourished a civilization so monumentally influential that they left behind colossal stone heads, sophisticated urban centers, and a cultural blueprint that would shape every major civilization that followed them for millennia to come. Yet today they remain frustratingly obscure in popular consciousness. Known primarily to academics and specialists rather than to the general public who readily discuss the Aztecs or the Maya. The Olmecs established themselves in the tropical lowlands of what is now Mexico, building cities like San Lorenzo and La Venta, where they developed complex social hierarchies, astronomical knowledge, and an intricate religious system centered around a mysterious jaguar deity. And they created the colossal stone heads that still baffle observers with their precise craftsmanship and inscrutable expressions. Monuments that required tremendous organizational power and resource mobilization to extract from quarries and transport across vast distances without the benefit of wheeled vehicles or metal tools. The psychological mechanism driving the Olmec's invisibility in collective memory operates through a curious inversion of historical visibility, wherein civilizations that left behind written records, monumental cities occupied until recent conquest, or dramatic narratives of conflict tend to dominate our historical imagination, while the Olmecs, whose cities were deliberately abandoned and whose writing system we cannot fully decipher, become relegated to the status of a mysterious predecessor civilization rather than a subject of fascination equal to their genuine achievements and sophistication. We have normalized this diminished historical presence by framing the Olmecs as merely a foundation rather than a complete civilization worthy of study in their own right, treating them as a stepping stone to the high in the arid valleys of Peru's central coast, roughly 5,000 years before the rise of the Inca Empire, there existed one of the world's oldest and most enigmatic civilizations, a culture so ancient and so thoroughly erased from popular consciousness that it remains virtually unknown outside academic circles, existing primarily in fragments of pottery, crumbling adobe structures, and the archaeological memories preserved in university archives rather than in the living cultural narratives of humanity. The Norte Chico civilization, which flourished between approximately 3000 and 1800 BCE, developed complex urban centers, monumental architecture, and sophisticated social hierarchies in one of the harshest environments on Earth, yet mysteriously vanished without leaving behind the written records, the monumental sculptures, or the continuity of cultural memory that typically allows civilizations to persist in human awareness. What makes Norte Chico particularly striking is that it emerged and developed entirely independently from Old World civilizations, creating pyramids and ceremonial centers that rivaled contemporary developments in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet this parallel achievement somehow escaped the historical consciousness that deems other ancient cultures worthy of sustained attention and popular reverence. The psychological mechanism underlying our collective amnesia regarding Norte Chico appears rooted in a fundamental bias within how we construct historical narratives, a tendency to privilege civilizations that produced writing systems, monumental art with clear iconography, or continuous cultural descendants who could transmit and amplify their ancestors' achievements through generations. Whereas Norte Chico's apparent lack of written language and its complete cultural discontinuity left no mechanism through which its accomplishments could be translated into the dramatic, comprehensible stories that capture. The Hittites emerged from the Anatolian plateau around 1600 BCE and within 3 centuries had constructed one of the ancient world's most formidable empires, commanding vast territories across modern-day Turkey, Syria, and the Levant through a combination of military innovation and sophisticated administrative systems that would influence civilizations for centuries to come. Yet by approximately 1100 BCE, this seemingly invincible power simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only fragmented inscriptions, ruined cities, and the profound mystery of how an empire that had once rivaled Egypt and Babylon could vanish so completely that later civilizations struggled to identify its very existence. The Hittites pioneered ironworking technology at a scale that gave them unprecedented military advantages, developed a complex feudal system of vassal states bound by written treaties, and created archives of thousands of cuneiform tablets that documented everything from royal correspondence to religious rituals with meticulous detail. Their capital of Hattusa sprawled across a fortified plateau, protected by massive walls and populated with tens of thousands of inhabitants who represented the administrative and cultural heart of their civilization. Yet somewhere in the transition between the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, catastrophic forces converged that this advanced civilization could not withstand, including widespread famine, internal instability, invasions from mysterious groups known as the Sea Peoples, and possibly environmental collapse that made their agricultural heartland unsustainable. What makes the Hittite disappearance particularly haunting is that we possess detailed records of their existence, but possess almost no contemporary accounts of their actual demise, leaving historians to reconstruct the final collapse from fragmentary evidence and archaeological remains that speak only through silence and absence. In the Anatolia region of modern-day Turkey, there existed one of humanity's first genuine urban settlements, a sprawling city of mud brick dwellings that rose and fell between roughly 9,000 and 7,400 years ago, yet remains almost entirely absent from popular understanding of ancient civilization despite its profound significance to our species. Çatalhöyük was not merely a collection of homes, but rather a densely packed community of up to 10,000 inhabitants living in rectangular structures built so closely together that residents traveled across rooftops rather than through ground-level streets, entering their homes through holes in the ceilings accessed by wooden ladders, a configuration that speaks to both practical necessity and deeply ingrained cultural values that we can only partially reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. The settlement itself covered approximately 13 hectares at its height, with successive layers of construction revealing the continuous habitation and rebuilding cycles that marked its long history. Yet the civilization vanished without leaving behind the monumental architecture, written records, or centralized systems of control that typically define what archaeologists consider a true civilization worthy of sustained scholarly attention. The people of Çatalhöyük supported themselves primarily through the cultivation of wheat and barley, the domestication of sheep and goats, and extensive hunting and gathering, creating a stable subsistence base that sustained one of the world's earliest high-density urban populations. Yet this achievement has been largely overshadowed by the later civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt that developed writing systems and hierarchical political structures. What persists as remarkable about Çatalhöyük is how thoroughly it has been forgotten by popular history despite offering invaluable insights into the developmental stages of human settlement, social. Between roughly 1600 and 1100 BCE, the Mycenaean civilization dominated the Greek mainland and surrounding regions, creating what many consider the first advanced Greek culture and the bridge between the ancient Bronze Age and the classical antiquity we know through Homer's epics. These warrior kings built massive palace complexes at sites like Mycenae, Pylos, and Turins, constructed elaborate tholos tombs filled with golden treasures, developed their own writing system called Linear B, and maintained extensive trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean and into Egypt and the Near East. Their society was hierarchical and militaristic, organized around powerful kings who commanded armies, collected taxes, and presided over religious ceremonies that bound the community together through shared belief in cosmic order. Yet around the 12th century BCE, this entire civilization collapsed in a manner so sudden and comprehensive that it left archaeologists struggling to explain for decades exactly what happened. The palaces burned, the writing systems disappeared, the trade networks vanished, the population dispersed, and within a few generations, the knowledge of how to build such structures or maintain such complex societies was lost. The psychological mechanism underlying this civilizational amnesia appears rooted in humanity's fragile relationship with accumulated knowledge and infrastructure. When the systems that maintain civilization face multiple simultaneous crises, whether invasion, climate change, plague, or economic breakdown, the institutional memory required to preserve advanced techniques deteriorates faster than the physical structures themselves. The Mycenaeans were not simply conquered by a single invader, but rather experienced what researchers now call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a cascade of interconnected failures that rendered their entire way of life impossible to sustain. Deep within the landscape of northern Nigeria, between roughly the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE, There flourished a civilization whose artistic sophistication and technological advancement seemed to emerge from nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously, leaving behind only fragmented terracotta sculptures and scattered archaeological sites that continue to perplex researchers to this day. The Nok culture, named after the village where distinctive figurines were first discovered in the 1930s, represents one of Africa's most enigmatic ancient societies, characterized by remarkably skilled craftspeople who produced hollow ceramic heads and figurines with refined features, geometric patterns, and an almost haunting sense of artistic maturity that suggests generations of accumulated knowledge and cultural refinement that we can no longer trace to its origins. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Nok derives from the profound dissonance between what we can see and what we cannot explain. Their sophisticated ironworking techniques, their complex social hierarchies evidenced by elaborate burial practices, and their apparent agricultural sophistication indicate a thriving civilization. Yet we possess almost no written records, no clear narrative of their rise or fall, and no definitive understanding of their religious beliefs or governmental structures. What makes the Nok disappearance particularly unsettling is how we have normalized our ignorance of them despite their obvious importance. They represent an entire world of human achievement that existed independent of European documentation or written historical records, and yet their absence from mainstream historical consciousness persists as though civilizations without written language somehow matter less or occupy a lesser reality than those whose deeds were recorded in text. Between the collapse of the classic Maya civilization and the rise of the Aztec Empire, a remarkable culture flourished across central Mexico for nearly 4 centuries, establishing itself as one of Mesoamerica's most influential yet ultimately mysterious societies. The Toltecs, whose name derived from the Nahuatl word meaning the people of Tula, emerged around the 10th century in the city of Tula, located in the modern Mexican state of Hidalgo, where they constructed an architectural and cultural legacy that would profoundly shape the civilizations that followed them. Their society was built upon a foundation of military prowess, urban sophistication, and religious innovation, creating a template for imperial expansion that subsequent Mesoamerican cultures would eagerly adopt and replicate. The psychological mechanism driving the Toltec civilization's prominence lay in their deliberate cultivation of a warrior culture that transformed martial skill into the very basis of their social hierarchy, their religious practice, and their understanding of cosmic order, making warfare not merely a political tool, but a cosmological necessity tied to maintaining the sun's movement across the sky. This warrior ideology permeated every aspect of their civilization, from their art depicting jaguars and eagles in combat poses to their architectural monuments adorned with carved serpents and skeletal figures, reinforcing a worldview in which conflict and sacrifice were essential forces that prevented universal chaos. Yet despite their formidable military reputation, their sophisticated urban planning, and their influential religious innovations including the cult of Quetzalcoatl, the Toltec civilization mysteriously declined and effectively vanished from prominence by the 12th century, fragmenting into smaller kingdoms and eventually fading from cultural memory with such completeness that later Mesoamerican peoples remembered them primarily through mythology. Beneath the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, a sprawling archaeological site that fundamentally challenged everything we believed we knew about human civilization and the development of complex society. Excavated beginning in the 1990s, this ancient sanctuary contains massive carved stone pillars arranged in circles, some reaching heights of 18 feet and weighing nearly 20 tons, all deliberately positioned and shaped with remarkable precision by a people we know virtually nothing about. The site dates back approximately 9,500 years, placing it squarely in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, thousands of years before the emergence of agriculture, writing, monumental architecture in Egypt, or anything we traditionally associate with civilization itself. The sheer scale and sophistication of Göbekli Tepe suggests that its builders possessed organizational capabilities, artistic vision, and engineering knowledge that we have no framework for understanding. Yet they left behind no pottery, no settlements, no domesticated plants, no written records, and no identifiable descendants. This civilization simply conducted their remarkable construction efforts and then vanished entirely from the archaeological record, leaving us with haunting stone monuments as the only testimony to their existence. The psychological mechanism underlying our difficulty in comprehending the Göbekli Tepe builders is our deeply ingrained assumption that societal complexity necessarily follows a linear progression from hunting and gathering to agriculture to civilization. We expect that monumental construction requires permanent settlements sustained by agricultural surplus, yet here stands undeniable evidence that profound human achievement and organization existed in the absence of these supposed prerequisites. The Scythians were a confederation of nomadic warrior societies that dominated the steppes of Central Asia and Eastern Europe from roughly the 9th century BCE until their gradual absorption and disappearance by the 3rd century CE, leaving behind one of history's most enigmatic legacies despite their profound influence on the ancient world. These horsemen, whose name has become almost mythological in our historical consciousness, were not a unified empire in the conventional sense, but rather a collection of related tribes bound together by shared cultural practices, language, and most importantly, by their unparalleled mastery of mounted warfare and horsemanship that made them simultaneously feared and admired by neighboring civilizations including the Greeks, Persians, and Chinese. The Scythians achieved their dominance not through the construction of permanent cities or monumental architecture, which is partially why their civilization feels so distant to modern understanding, but rather through their exceptional mobility, their sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare, and their development of advanced weaponry, including the composite bow, which could be wielded effectively from horseback and represented a technological innovation that fundamentally changed military strategy across the known world. Archaeological evidence reveals that Scythian society was hierarchical and sophisticated, with elaborate burial mounds called kurgans containing golden artifacts, intricate metalwork, and grave goods that demonstrate a civilization of considerable wealth and artistic refinement. Yet they left no written records of their own, which means our knowledge of them comes almost entirely through the accounts of Greek historians like Herodotus, whose descriptions were often colored by outsider perspectives and cultural biases. Between the 1st and 7th centuries, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, there rose one of the ancient world's most sophisticated and powerful civilizations, the Kingdom of Aksum, yet today it remains remarkably obscure in popular historical consciousness despite its profound influence across 3 continents. At its zenith, Aksum controlled vast territories stretching from the Red Sea to the interior of Africa, commanding crucial trade routes between Rome, India, and China, and minting its own currency with the faces of its monarchs stamped in gold and silver, a privilege reserved only for the world's greatest empires of that era. The kingdom's capital city of Aksum itself was a cosmopolitan center of learning and commerce, filled with towering stone monuments, sophisticated irrigation systems, temples honoring both Christian and pre-Christian deities, and merchants speaking dozens of languages as they negotiated the exchange of frankincense, myrrh, ivory, and spices. Yet the mechanisms of Aksum's gradual decline appear almost paradoxical in their nature, for the very success that made the kingdom wealthy ultimately transformed its position from advantage to vulnerability. As Christianity spread throughout the Byzantine world and Islamic expansion reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean and Arabian Peninsula, Aksum found itself increasingly isolated, no longer the cosmopolitan crossroads, but rather a Christian enclave surrounded by rising Islamic powers, its once vital trade routes gradually redirected toward ports and cities beyond its control. The kingdom did not collapse suddenly through invasion or catastrophic war, but rather experienced a slow-motion dissolution as its economic foundations crumbled, its international influence waned, and its people gradually retreated deeper into the highlands, eventually transforming into the Ethiopian and Eritrean civilizations that would dominate the region for C. In the far northern reaches of what is now Scotland, between roughly the 3rd and 9th centuries, there existed a civilization so enigmatic and so thoroughly absorbed into history that their very name has become synonymous with mystery itself. The Picts were a people whose language remains only partially understood, whose origins continue to perplex historians, and whose cultural identity was so thoroughly erased by successive waves of Celtic and Norse invasions that we know them primarily through the fragmented accounts of their enemies and the cryptic symbol stones they left behind. Archaeological evidence suggests they were among the most sophisticated societies of early medieval Britain, developing intricate metalwork, establishing complex trade networks, and creating a visual artistic tradition of remarkable refinement. Yet within a few centuries, they simply ceased to exist as a distinct people, their identity absorbed entirely into the emerging Scottish kingdom. The mechanism of their disappearance reveals itself not as sudden conquest or catastrophic collapse, but as a gradual process of cultural assimilation and political reorganization, wherein the Pictish nobility intermarried with incoming Gaelic and Norse ruling classes, their language slowly displaced by Gaelic, their traditions reinterpreted through the lens of Christianity and Celtic culture, until the very concept of being Pictish lost all practical meaning. What makes their vanishing particularly striking is how completely they vanished, leaving behind no written records in their own language, no continuous historical narrative, no surviving oral traditions, only mysterious carved symbol stones whose meaning scholars still debate, and fragments of their story told by Irish monks and Norse raiders who encountered them at the periphery of their own expanding worlds. Deep in the southwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Guadalquivir River flows toward the Atlantic Ocean, there existed a civilization so wealthy and influential that ancient Greek writers could scarcely believe it was real, yet so completely obliterated from history that archaeologists still debate whether it ever truly existed at all. This was Tartessos, a mysterious Bronze Age culture that flourished sometime between the 9th and 6th centuries before Christ, commanding vast deposits of tin, silver, and copper that made it the envy of the Mediterranean world. The merchants and seafarers of Tartessos established trade networks spanning from Phoenician cities to Greek colonies, their ships laden with precious metals and exotic goods that made them legendary throughout antiquity. Yet today we possess almost no direct evidence of their cities, their kings, or even their language. The mechanism behind Tartessos' disappearance from the historical record lies in the very nature of ancient documentation itself, for the civilization was known primarily through the accounts of foreign traders and writers who described it in fragments, making it impossible to distinguish fact from exaggeration, reality from myth. Herodotus and other classical writers spoke of Tartessos in tones usually reserved for fairy tales, describing immense wealth and power that seemed so implausible that later scholars relegated the entire civilization to the realm of legend, treating it as a fictional place invented by storytellers rather than an actual historical society. Yet geological evidence, scattered archaeological findings, and references in Phoenician texts suggest something very real did exist in this region, a prosperous society that was gradually absorbed, conquered, or displaced by the expanding Carthaginian and Roman powers, its identity so thoroughly erased that it became easier to dismiss it as mythology than to acknowledge that an entire advanced civi. The Zapotec civilization emerged in the valley of Oaxaca around 1500 BCE, establishing themselves as one of Mesoamerica's most sophisticated and enduring cultures. Yet their story remains largely eclipsed in popular consciousness by the more celebrated Aztec and Maya civilizations. For over 2,000 years, the Zapotecs developed complex urban centers, intricate writing systems, advanced astronomical knowledge, and elaborate religious practices that shaped the intellectual landscape of ancient Mexico. Their capital at Monte Alban became one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas, commanding the valley from a carefully engineered mountaintop settlement with monumental architecture, residential districts, and administrative buildings that reflected a highly organized society. The Zapotecs created their own distinct hieroglyphic writing system predating even the classic Maya, developed sophisticated pottery and textile traditions, and established trade networks that connected them to distant regions. The psychological mechanism that has contributed to their obscurity lies partly in the success and visibility of their contemporaries. The Aztec Empire's dramatic conquest by Spanish forces created a narrative vacuum that other civilizations have struggled to fill within popular historical discourse. Additionally, the Zapotec civilization never experienced a single, catastrophic collapse, but rather underwent gradual transformation and adaptation, making it less dramatic and consequently less memorable in storytelling traditions. The remarkable persistence of Zapotec culture, despite nearly 5 centuries of colonialism, demonstrates their societal resilience. Yet this very continuity has normalized their presence, paradoxically rendering them less visible in global narratives than civilizations that vanished more completely. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the distant shores of the Arabian Peninsula lay Dilmun, a civilization that flourished as one of the ancient world's most sophisticated trading hubs, yet has been almost entirely erased from popular historical memory despite its profound influence on Mesopotamian culture and commerce. Dilmun, located on the island of Bahrain and surrounding coastal regions, served as the critical intermediary between the wealthy Indus Valley civilizations and the great Sumerian and Akkadian empires, controlling vast networks of maritime trade that transported precious goods including lapis lazuli, ivory, pearls, and exotic woods across thousands of miles of open ocean. The Dilmunites were master navigators and merchants who understood the monsoon winds, the treacherous waters of the Persian Gulf, and the intricate logistics of connecting distant economic systems, establishing a commercial infrastructure so effective that it persisted for over 2,000 years without interruption. In ancient texts, Dilmun was mythologized as a sacred place, a gateway between worlds, a land blessed by the gods where sickness did not exist and death held no dominion. Yet this spiritual reverence masked a deeply pragmatic reality. Dilmun's true power lay not in divine favor, but in its geographic position and the entrepreneurial genius of its people. The civilization possessed sophisticated administrative systems, monumental architecture, and complex social hierarchies that rivaled those of its larger neighbors. Yet because Dilmun produced no great military empire and left no monumental legacy comparable to the pyramids or ziggurats, it gradually faded from historical consciousness. Archaeological evidence reveals intricate seals, warehouses, shipbuilding facilities, and residential quarters that suggest a vibrant, cosmopolitan society. Yet modern historical narratives have minimized Dilmun's significance, treating it as merely a footnote in grand. Between 6000 and 3000 BCE, across the fertile plains of what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, there existed one of prehistory's most sophisticated civilizations, a culture so advanced in certain respects that archaeologists initially refused to believe the evidence before them. The Quecuteni people constructed enormous circular settlements containing hundreds of dwellings arranged in concentric rings, some villages spanning nearly 300 acres and housing thousands of inhabitants. Yet they inexplicably abandoned these cities at regular intervals, burning their own structures to the ground and relocating to new sites miles away. These were not primitive squatters or nomadic tribes, but rather a people who possessed intricate pottery with geometric designs of stunning complexity, who practiced sophisticated agriculture, who maintained extensive trade networks across Europe, and who demonstrated a level of urban planning that would not be matched again in Eastern Europe for thousands of years. The psychological mechanism behind this cyclical destruction remains one of archaeology's deepest puzzles, with researchers proposing theories ranging from ritual purification ceremonies to practical agricultural rotation to the aftermath of periodic warfare. Yet no single explanation satisfies the complete archaeological record. What persists in our understanding of this civilization is not primarily the brilliance of their achievements or the mystery of their methods, but rather our fascination with the paradox of a people sophisticated enough to build cities on such a grand scale, yet apparently compelled to destroy them with regularity, suggesting that perhaps their abandonment was not a failure of civilization, but rather a fundamentally different philosophical approach to permanence, possession, and renewal that operated according to principles almost entirely foreign to the settled, accumulative society's thought. The Kingdom of Kush emerged along the Nile River in what is now Sudan, rising to prominence around 1500 BCE as a powerful successor state to Egypt itself, eventually conquering and ruling over Egypt for nearly a century during the 25th dynasty before fading into obscurity and ultimately vanishing from historical consciousness entirely. This remarkable civilization developed a sophisticated society with its own writing system, religious practices, and administrative structures, yet it has been largely overshadowed and forgotten in popular historical narratives, relegated to footnotes in accounts that focus primarily on its relationship with Egypt rather than its independent achievements and cultural contributions. The psychological mechanism behind this erasure involves a deeply rooted historical bias where dominant civilizations, particularly those that left more abundant written records in languages familiar to later European scholars, became the central focus of historical study, while contemporaneous African kingdoms were systematically deprioritized and marginalized in academic discourse. Kush had two great capitals, first Napata and later Meroe, and these cities hosted thriving centers of trade, agriculture, and intellectual life that sustained millions of people and generated considerable wealth through commerce with Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean world. Yet these achievements remain largely unknown outside specialized academic circles. The normalization of this forgotten status reflects how historical narratives have been constructed and transmitted through institutions that inherited certain prejudices and assumptions about which civilizations were worthy of remembrance and study, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where Kush's absence from popular historical consciousness makes it easier for subsequent generations to overlook its significance entirely. Deep within the Sahara Desert, nestled between the vast sand seas of North Africa, there existed a civilization so sophisticated and so utterly removed from the understanding of Mediterranean peoples that its very existence seemed almost mythological to the ancient world. The Garamantes, centered in the Fezzan region of what is now Libya, built an empire that flourished for nearly 1,000 years, from approximately the 4th century before the Common Era until around the 1st century of the Common Era, commanding trade routes, cultivating vast agricultural settlements in an impossibly hostile environment, and maintaining a society complex enough to support craftsmen, merchants, priests, and warriors across their desert kingdom. What made the Garamantes truly remarkable was not merely their existence in such an inhospitable landscape, but rather how they achieved it through an intricate system of underground water channels called fagara, which they engineered with remarkable precision to transport precious water from deep aquifers to the surface. Creating oases where none naturally existed and establishing a network of settlements connected by carefully maintained trade roads that stretched across the Sahara to link them with the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa. Archaeological evidence reveals that they built substantial towns with stone architecture, produced distinctive pottery and metalwork, raised livestock across their territories, and accumulated wealth significant enough to attract the attention of external powers. Yet despite their demonstrable achievements in engineering, agriculture, and commerce, the Garamantes left virtually no written records that survived to modern times. Meaning that almost everything we know about them comes from fragmentary references in Roman texts, from the physical remains of their settlements, and from the gradual rediscovery of their archaeological footprint by 20th and 21st century. Between roughly 800 and 1300 CE, the Ancestral Puebloans, formerly known as the Anasazi, constructed one of North America's most sophisticated pre-Columbian societies across the American Southwest, developing intricate networks of settlements, trade routes, and architectural marvels that spanned across present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. These remarkable people engineered multi-story stone dwellings, created sophisticated irrigation systems to cultivate crops in an arid landscape, produced distinctive black-on-black pottery, and established ceremonial centers like Chaco Canyon that served as hubs of cultural and spiritual significance for hundreds of miles. Archaeological evidence reveals a civilization that understood mathematics, astronomy, and engineering principles, constructing roads with precision and designing kivas, circular ceremonial chambers that demonstrated advanced knowledge of acoustics and celestial alignment. Yet around 1300 CE, this flourishing civilization mysteriously abandoned their established settlements and dispersed across the region, a phenomenon that archaeologists and historians have spent decades attempting to understand. The prevailing theories suggest that a combination of environmental factors, including prolonged drought lasting decades, resource depletion, climate fluctuations, and possibly social upheaval or spiritual migration beliefs, prompted the ancestral Puebloans to leave their ancestral homelands and relocate to areas with more reliable water sources. The psychological mechanism underlying civilization's abandonment of established territories involves a complex calculus where immediate survival needs override cultural attachment to place. And when environmental conditions deteriorate beyond sustainability thresholds, even deeply rooted communities recognize that continuation of their way of life requires mobility rather than persistence. Deep in the mountainous regions of southeastern Europe, between the Aegean Sea and the Danube River, existed one of antiquity's most enigmatic civilizations. The Thracians, a warrior culture that flourished from around the 12th century before the Common Era until their absorption into the Roman Empire in the 1st century. The Thracians were never a unified nation in the modern sense, but rather a collection of independent tribes and kingdoms, each governed by its own nobility and maintaining fierce pride in their distinct identities, yet sharing common linguistic roots, religious practices, and cultural traditions that bound them together as a recognizable people. These fierce horsemen and skilled metalworkers dominated the lands of modern-day Bulgaria, parts of Romania, Greece, and Turkey for over 1,000 years. Yet today they remain one of history's most obscure civilizations, their legacy overshadowed by more celebrated neighbors like Greece and Rome. The Thracians excelled in warfare, developing sophisticated cavalry tactics that would later influence even the legendary Alexander the Great, and their smiths produced weaponry and metalwork of such exceptional quality that it was coveted across the Mediterranean world. They possessed a rich mythological tradition, credited with originating the cult of Dionysus and the worship of Orpheus, figures whose spiritual significance permeated Greek culture itself. Yet despite their military prowess, cultural sophistication, and the sheer span of their civilization, the Thracians left behind remarkably few written records, relying instead on an oral tradition that evaporated as their political independence crumbled. This absence of documentation created a paradoxical invisibility wherein a powerful civilization gradually faded from historical consciousness, remembered only through fragmentary references in Greek and Roman texts written by outsiders who often dismissed Thracian culture as barbaric. In the heart of the Yangtze River Valley, buried beneath layers of earth and time, lies one of ancient China's most enigmatic civilizations, the Sanxingdui Culture, which flourished between approximately 1600 and 1200 BCE during the Bronze Age of East Asia. This sophisticated society, centered in what is now Sichuan province, developed an elaborate urban culture with monumental architecture, advanced bronze casting techniques, and a complex social hierarchy that rivaled contemporary civilizations across the world, yet virtually no one outside of specialist circles has ever heard of it. The archaeological evidence reveals a people who possessed remarkable technological achievements, including massive bronze vessels, intricate jade carvings, and gold ornaments that demonstrate mastery over materials and artistic vision, suggesting a centralized authority capable of mobilizing enormous resources for cultural and religious purposes. Yet despite these undeniable markers of advanced civilization, the Sanxingdui culture suddenly vanished from the archaeological record around 1200 BCE, leaving behind only puzzling artifacts that seem disconnected from the known development of subsequent Chinese dynasties, as if this entire world of people, beliefs, and accomplishments simply ceased to exist without explanation. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Sanxingdui stems from the human compulsion to find narrative coherence in history, to trace linear progression from one civilization to the next, and when we encounter a sophisticated culture that does not fit neatly into our established timelines, we experience a cognitive dissonance that both disturbs and captivates us. The mystery deepens because the artifacts themselves appear foreign to what we expect from early Chinese culture, including strange bronze masks with exaggerated features and unusual religious iconography that suggest a world. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, there emerged around 3500 BCE one of humanity's first complex civilizations, the Sumerians, who would mysteriously vanish from the historical record by around 1900 BCE, leaving behind only fragmentary traces of what was once an extraordinarily sophisticated society. The Sumerians developed the world's first known system of writing, cuneiform, which they pressed into clay tablets to record everything from administrative transactions to epic poetry and religious hymns. Yet somehow this advanced civilization that invented irrigation systems, created monumental ziggurats, established early forms of democracy in city-states, and maintained extensive trade networks across the ancient world simply ceased to exist as a distinct cultural entity. What makes their disappearance particularly puzzling is that the Sumerians did not vanish entirely in a dramatic apocalyptic event, but rather their identity gradually merged into the broader Babylonian and Akkadian cultures that invaded and assimilated their territory, a process so complete that their unique language, customs, and ethnic identity were absorbed and eventually forgotten. The psychological mechanism behind this forgotten status appears rooted in how civilizations are remembered through conquest and domination. For the Sumerian people were eventually overwhelmed by successive waves of Akkadian, Amorite, and other invading populations who imposed their own languages, religions, and cultural narratives upon the conquered lands, effectively erasing Sumerian distinctiveness from collective memory. We have normalized this historical forgetting despite possessing physical evidence of Sumerian achievements, because our understanding of ancient history tends to privilege the dominant powers and their records over the subsumed cultures, and the very cuneiform tablets that the Sumerians created were later repurposed and rewritten by their conqueror. Deep within the ancient records of Egypt lies the mystery of Punt, a land so significant to the pharaohs that they commissioned elaborate expeditions across treacherous waters. Yet today we cannot definitively locate where this enigmatic civilization actually stood. The Egyptians called it the Land of God, a place of immense wealth and exotic resources that appeared repeatedly in their historical documents, most famously documented during the reign of Hatshepsut in the 15th century before the Common Era, when an expedition returned with myrrh trees, incense, gold, ebony, and other treasures that would enrich the kingdom for generations. Ancient texts describe Punt as existing beyond the Red Sea, likely situated somewhere along the Horn of Africa in what is now modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or Djibouti. Yet despite centuries of archaeological investigation and scholarly debate, no conclusive physical evidence of a coherent Punt civilization has ever been discovered. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Punt stems from the fundamental human need to solve mysteries and validate ancient texts, creating a cognitive pattern wherein we become so invested in the historical narrative that the absence of evidence paradoxically strengthens rather than weakens our conviction that the place must have existed. We have collectively normalized the idea of a phantom civilization, accepting that Punt represents not necessarily a unified political entity, but rather a geographic concept that the Egyptians themselves may have understood only vaguely, a distant trading partner whose true nature remains obscured by time and the limitations of ancient geographical knowledge. Yet we continue to search and theorize because the alternative, acknowledging that some ancient references may be exaggerated, misunderstood, or deliberately mythologized, challenges our assumption that ancient civilizations possessed perfect knowledge of their world. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, a powerful empire emerged in the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caucasus Mountains, controlling vast trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and the Middle East through their strategic heartland. The Khazars built a sophisticated civilization with a complex governmental structure, multiple cities, and a military apparatus that rivaled neighboring powers. Yet today their memory has been almost entirely erased from popular consciousness despite their enormous historical significance. What makes the Khazars particularly fascinating is that they appear to have adopted Judaism as their state religion, making them perhaps the only major political power in medieval history to embrace this faith at an institutional level, a fact that has made them the subject of intense scholarly debate and, unfortunately, considerable mythologizing. The empire maintained diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and various European kingdoms, serving as a crucial buffer zone and trading intermediary for centuries. Yet this prominence somehow failed to secure them a lasting place in historical memory. The psychological mechanism underlying their disappearance from collective consciousness relates to how civilizations become historically invisible when their geographic center shifts away from the Mediterranean and European focus that dominated historical record-keeping, and when their cultural and religious legacy cannot be easily claimed by successor states or dominant powers. The Khazars were ultimately weakened by pressure from Rus' principalities to the north and the rise of new Islamic powers, gradually losing territory and influence until they fragmented into smaller groups and disappeared as a unified political entity by the 11th century. Between approximately 4,800 and 3,800 years ago, across the vast expanse of Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to central Germany and from Scandinavia to Italy, a remarkably distinctive archaeological culture emerged and then vanished almost as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving behind countless distinctive pottery vessels shaped like inverted bells that would eventually give this enigmatic civilization its name. The Bell Beaker people were not a unified empire or organized nation in any conventional sense, but rather a complex network of communities and trading populations that shared remarkably similar material cultures, artistic traditions, and burial practices despite being separated by hundreds of kilometers and several generations of human migration and social change. What makes the Bell Beaker culture particularly fascinating to modern archaeologists is that it appears to have spread not through military conquest or forced colonization, but rather through a combination of cultural diffusion, trade networks, and the movement of peoples who carried with them distinctive technologies, including sophisticated metalworking techniques, advanced archery methods, and the ability to produce uniform ceramics that ranged from utilitarian to ceremonial in purpose. The psychological mechanism underlying the Bell Beaker phenomenon seems to have been a form of cultural prestige and desirability, wherein communities encountering these foreign peoples and their impressive artifacts, particularly their elegant bell-shaped drinking vessels and advanced copper metallurgy, found these innovations worth adopting and integrating into their own societies, creating a widespread cultural horizon without requiring political unification or coercive power structures. High in the Carpathian Mountains of what is now Romania, there existed a kingdom whose people possessed remarkable engineering skills, intricate social structures, and a fierce independent spirit that would ultimately seal their fate. The Dacians, a Thracian people who flourished between the 5th century before Christ and the early 2nd century after, built a sophisticated civilization that rivaled many of their more famous contemporaries, yet their name has been largely erased from popular historical consciousness despite their profound influence on the region. Their kingdom, stretching across territories rich with gold and strategic importance, represented one of the most formidable non-Mediterranean powers of antiquity. Yet today they remain relegated to obscurity, known primarily by specialists and regional historians rather than occupying their rightful place in the broader narrative of ancient European history. The Dacian state organized itself around powerful monarchs and developed complex military structures that successfully defended against numerous incursions, constructed impressive fortifications that demonstrated sophisticated architectural understanding, and maintained trade networks extending across the continent. Yet somehow this prosperity and achievement has faded into near invisibility in modern consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying this erasure stems partly from the Roman perspective that has dominated historical writing for centuries. As Rome ultimately conquered Dacia under Emperor Trajan around 106 CE, and Roman victors wrote the historical accounts that survived, inevitably framing Dacian culture through the lens of conquest rather than independent achievement. Moreover, the assimilation of Dacian peoples into Roman colonial society meant that their distinct identity gradually dissolved, leaving fragmentary archaeological evidence rather than the continuous written records that other civilizations. High in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, lie the ruins of Tiwanaku, one of the most mysterious and architecturally advanced civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas, which flourished between approximately 300 and 1000 CE before vanishing into obscurity, leaving behind monumental stone structures and unanswered questions about its sudden collapse. The site itself reveals a civilization of remarkable sophistication, featuring precisely cut megalithic blocks fitted together with extraordinary accuracy, intricate stone carvings depicting supernatural beings and geometric patterns, and evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge embedded within their architectural alignments. The Tiwanakuans developed an extensive empire spanning parts of modern-day Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, controlling highland trade routes and managing vast agricultural systems across multiple ecological zones. Yet despite their apparent power and organizational capability, they abandoned their ceremonial centers and dispersed into smaller communities, leaving behind monuments that would perplex researchers for centuries. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Tiwanaku's disappearance stems from cognitive dissonance when confronting civilizations that achieved remarkable technological and organizational feats, yet still succumbed to forces we struggle to identify, forcing us to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that human achievement offers no guarantee against historical erasure or societal fragmentation. Archaeological evidence suggests multiple contributing factors including severe drought linked to climate oscillations, overextension of their administrative systems, resource depletion from intensive agriculture, and possibly epidemic disease. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the comprehensiveness of their departure or the suddenness with which their characteristic cultural practices ceased. Between the 6th and 10th centuries, high in the Andes Mountains of what is now Peru, there existed a vast and sophisticated civilization known as the Wari Empire, a power that controlled territory spanning over 400 miles and commanded millions of subjects across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The Wari people built an extensive network of administrative centers, temples, and settlements across the highlands and coastal regions, creating one of the earliest examples of a truly expansionist empire in South American history. Yet today their name remains virtually unknown to the general public, obscured beneath the far more famous shadow of their successors, the Inca. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Wari maintained complex bureaucratic systems, invested heavily in agricultural infrastructure, including sophisticated terracing and irrigation networks that transformed mountainous landscapes into productive farmland, and developed a distinctive artistic style featuring bold geometric patterns and religious iconography that spread across their domains through deliberate cultural dissemination. The empire appears to have functioned through a hierarchical structure where regional governors administered distant provinces, connected by an impressive system of roads predating the later Inca highway network, suggesting a civilization equally concerned with infrastructure and centralized control as with conquest itself. The psychological mechanism underlying the Wari's disappearance from historical consciousness relates fundamentally to the nature of historical documentation and cultural continuity. The Wari left no written records that could be easily deciphered by later populations, relying instead on architectural monuments and ceramic artifacts whose meanings proved increasingly opaque as generations passed, and when the Inca later rose to dominance in the region, they either destroyed or absorbed Wari cultural markers. Deep in the heart of ancient Nubia, along the fertile banks of the Nile River in what is now Sudan, there flourished a sophisticated and powerful civilization known as the Kerma culture, which dominated the region from approximately 2500 to 1500 BCE, yet today remains one of the least known and most overlooked civilizations in the entire ancient world. The Kerma people built their capital city at a location bearing the same name, constructing massive mud brick fortifications, elaborate temples, and residential complexes that demonstrated remarkable architectural knowledge and organizational capacity, rivaling the contemporary kingdoms of Egypt itself. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Kerma was not a primitive settlement, but rather a thriving urban center with distinct social hierarchies, specialized craftspeople, advanced agricultural systems, and a flourishing trade network that extended throughout northeastern Africa and connected to distant Mediterranean civilizations. The culture is particularly known for its distinctive pottery with characteristic thin red ware decorated with intricate patterns, its practice of burying leaders with vast quantities of sacrificial cattle and human attendants, and its apparent ability to command considerable military resources and territorial control. Yet despite these impressive achievements and the undeniable sophistication of their society, the Kerma culture has been systematically marginalized in historical narratives, overshadowed by the dominant discourse surrounding ancient Egypt, which borders Nubia to the north. This erasure persists because early European scholars operating within frameworks of racial and cultural hierarchy positioned African civilizations as secondary, derivative, or less developed than their Mediterranean counterparts, and this interpretive bias became institutionalized within academic structures and popular understanding. In the shadowy margins of ancient Mediterranean history lies the story of the Illyrians, a confederation of Indo-European tribes whose sophisticated civilization flourished across the Balkan Peninsula for more than 1,000 years before dissolving almost entirely from historical memory and collective consciousness. The Illyrians inhabited the coastal and mountainous regions of what is now Albania, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and parts of Greece and Macedonia, establishing themselves as formidable seafarers, traders, and warriors who left indelible marks upon the ancient world despite their eventual erasure from popular understanding. Archaeological evidence reveals complex social structures, advanced maritime commerce, fortified settlements, and artistic traditions that rivaled their Mediterranean contemporaries, yet their civilization remains profoundly obscured, known primarily through fragments preserved in Greek and Roman texts rather than through their own documented voices. What makes the Illyrian disappearance particularly striking is the psychological mechanism underlying it. The classical world's tendency to marginalize and minimize cultures that existed outside the dominant Greek and Roman spheres of influence created a persistent historiographical bias that diminished Illyrian achievements and agency. The Romans ultimately conquered the Illyrian territories through brutal military campaigns spanning decades, incorporating their lands into the empire's Dalmatian and Pannonian provinces, which directly contributed to the cultural assimilation and gradual dilution of distinct Illyrian identity and traditions. Yet curiously, this erasure has persisted long after Rome's own collapse, surviving through medieval and modern periods despite archaeological rediscovery and scholarly research that could have restored Illyrian prominence to historical narratives, suggesting that the initial prejudices embedded in ancient sources maintained there. Deep within the Indus Valley lies one of humanity's most perplexing archaeological mysteries, a sprawling urban center that flourished around 4,600 years ago before vanishing almost without trace, leaving behind only silent streets and unanswered questions about why such an advanced civilization could simply cease to exist. Mohenjo-Daro, meaning Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language, emerged during the height of the Indus Valley Civilization, a society that rivaled the contemporary cultures of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in sophistication and scale, yet somehow disappeared from the historical record with minimal explanation or surviving oral traditions that might illuminate its fate. The city itself represented remarkable urban planning, with streets laid out in precise grid patterns, sophisticated drainage systems that surpassed anything found in comparable ancient societies, and monumental structures suggesting a complex hierarchical organization. Yet archaeologists continue to struggle with the fundamental question of what happened to its inhabitants and why such accomplishments were forgotten by subsequent generations across the region. The psychological mechanism underlying this mystery involves our tendency to assume that great civilizations either transform gradually into successor cultures or collapse spectacularly through invasion and warfare, creating a narrative framework that feels intellectually satisfying even when evidence contradicts these comfortable assumptions. Yet Mohenjo-Daro presents neither scenario clearly. The city shows signs of environmental stress, possible flooding, climate change, and resource depletion. But these factors alone fail to fully explain the apparent sudden abandonment and the curious absence of direct cultural continuity with later Vedic societies that emerged in the same geographic regions. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the Cham people established one of Southeast Asia's most sophisticated maritime trading empires along the coast of what is now central Vietnam, creating a civilization that commanded vast networks of commerce across the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. The Cham built magnificent port cities, developed advanced agricultural systems in their coastal plains, and constructed elaborate temple complexes that rivaled the architectural achievements of their contemporaries. Yet within a few centuries, this once dominant culture had been almost entirely absorbed, displaced, and forgotten by successive waves of Vietnamese expansion and conquest. What emerges from studying the Cham is a pattern of cultural erasure driven not by catastrophic natural disaster or sudden invasion alone, but rather by the relentless pressure of demographic change and political conquest that gradually overwhelmed a civilization without entirely destroying it, creating instead a fragmented diaspora scattered across multiple nations and generations. The psychological mechanism behind this forgetting operates through the lens of Victor's history, where the dominant Vietnamese culture, expanding southward in what historians call the Nam Viet process, systematized the Cham narrative into their own historical framework, reframing independent Cham kingdoms not as equal civilizations, but as obstacles overcome, as territories conquered, and ultimately as peoples whose cultural identity became subordinate to the expanding state. The Cham civilization persists in fragments today, with small Cham Muslim communities surviving in Cambodia and Vietnam, maintaining pockets of their language and traditions, yet the broader world has largely normalized their erasure from the grand narrative of Southeast Asian history, accepting without question that their cities, trade routes, and political independence simply faded into obscurity rather than reckon. High in the mountainous regions where modern-day Turkey, Armenia, and Iran converge, there existed a powerful kingdom that commanded respect and resources for nearly 3 centuries, yet today remains remarkably obscure in popular historical consciousness. Urartu, known to its own people as Bianali, flourished from approximately the 9th century BCE until its conquest and absorption by the expanding Median and later Persian empires around the 6th century BCE. This was a civilization of remarkable military sophistication, architectural ambition, and cultural complexity that rivaled and often contested with the mighty Assyrian Empire for dominance of the ancient Near East. The Urartians constructed an extensive network of fortified cities carved strategically into mountainous terrain, built sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed arid highlands into productive agricultural zones, and developed a distinctive artistic tradition reflected in their metalwork, stone carvings, and inscriptions. Their kingdom stretched across the Armenian highlands, controlling vital trade routes and mountain passes while maintaining a complex bureaucratic system that allowed them to administer a vast, geographically fragmented territory. Yet despite this prominence and power, Urartu has virtually vanished from mainstream historical narratives and public awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this disappearance rests partly on geography and accessibility. Their heartland in the difficult mountainous terrain made archaeological investigation challenging for centuries, and partly on the overwhelming shadow cast by better documented civilizations like Assyria and Persia that surrounded and ultimately consumed them. Furthermore, the Urartian language and writing system, while decipherable, remained regionally specific and never achieved the widespread diplomatic use that kept other ancient languages alive in historical memory. In the second millennium before the Common Era, across the fertile plains of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, a civilization emerged that would fundamentally reshape the power dynamics of the ancient Near East through military innovation and shrewd political maneuvering. Yet within 5 centuries would dissolve into obscurity, leaving behind only fragmented inscriptions and the bewildered accounts of neighboring empires. The Mitanni were an Indo-Aryan people who rose to prominence around 1550 BCE, establishing a kingdom that stretched across the Euphrates River and dominated the region known as Mitanni or Naharina, controlling crucial trade routes and agricultural heartlands that made them a formidable force alongside the Egyptian and Hittite empires. They introduced the horse-drawn chariot as a weapon of war refined to devastating efficiency, breeding superior horses and developing military tactics that gave them overwhelming advantages in open battle, making them the dominant military power of their age and forcing neighboring kingdoms to seek treaties and strategic marriages to contain their influence. The Mitanni royal courts became centers of cultural synthesis, where Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian influences blended into a sophisticated civilization that produced intricate artwork, advanced administration, and diplomatic protocols that would influence interstate relations for generations. Yet despite their military supremacy and cultural achievements, the Mitanni gradually weakened through internal conflicts between competing royal factions, succession disputes that fragmented their political unity, and the relentless pressure from the rising Hittite Empire under kings like Sipilulima I, who systematically conquered their territories and reduced their sphere of influence. The Xia Dynasty represents one of history's most tantalizing mysteries, a civilization that Chinese historical texts describe in great detail yet which has eluded conclusive archaeological verification for millennia. According to traditional Chinese historiography, the Xia dynasty ruled from approximately 2100 to 1600 BCE, making it the earliest recorded Chinese dynasty and the successor to the age of legendary sage kings who supposedly established the foundations of Chinese culture. The historical records, preserved in texts like the Bamboo Annals and referenced extensively in Confucian literature, paint a vivid picture of early dynastic rule, technological advancement, and cultural development, describing rulers like Yu the Great who supposedly managed catastrophic floods through engineering rather than prayer. Yet despite these incredibly detailed narratives spanning centuries of supposed rule and dozens of named emperors, modern archaeologists have found themselves unable to definitively prove that the Xia dynasty ever actually existed as a centralized political entity. The mechanism underlying this historical puzzle involves the fundamental challenge of distinguishing between written legend and archaeological reality, for ancient texts cannot be trusted as unconditional proof without corroborating physical evidence, and the gap between cultural memory and material traces can stretch across centuries. Chinese scholars constructed elaborate chronologies and genealogies based on ancient texts, creating a seamless narrative that felt so internally consistent and detailed that it became accepted as historical fact within academic circles and popular consciousness alike. What remains peculiar is how thoroughly this unverified dynasty has been integrated into Chinese historical consciousness, and how persistently it occupies a prominent place in discussions of ancient Chinese civilization despite the fundamental absence of Defi. Between roughly 1600 and 1100 BCE, the island of Sardinia hosted one of the Mediterranean's most distinctive and architecturally advanced societies, the Nuragic people, whose name derives from the Nurag, the distinctive megalithic towers that dotted their landscape like sentinels frozen in time. These fortress-like structures, built from precisely stacked stone blocks without mortar, rose in conical or cylindrical forms across the island's terrain, serving as defensive positions, administrative centers, and symbols of community identity that unified scattered settlements into an interconnected network of power and protection. The Nuragic civilization developed sophisticated bronzeworking techniques, created intricate pottery, maintained extensive trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean to the Aegean and North Africa, and organized themselves into a complex society with clear hierarchies, ritual practices, and shared cultural values that bonded thousands of individuals across generations. Yet this advanced civilization, which had weathered centuries of Mediterranean upheaval and maintained its distinctive character through periods when other Bronze Age societies crumbled into dust, gradually weakened and fragmented beginning around 1100 BCE, eventually losing coherence and cultural continuity until it disappeared entirely from historical prominence. The psychological mechanism underlying the Nuragic decline involves the paradoxical relationship between isolation and vulnerability. Sardinia's geographic separation, which had initially protected the civilization and allowed it to develop unique characteristics, ultimately rendered it increasingly defenseless against the coordinated pressures of Mediterranean colonization, the movement of Phoenician and Greek settlers who sought to establish trading posts and influence, and the broader systemic collapse of Bronze Age trade networks that had enriched Nuragic society for Sen. The Sarmatian peoples, who dominated the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caucasus from roughly the 5th century before the Common Era through the 4th century after, developed one of history's most formidable military innovations. The Cataphract, a heavily armored mounted warrior whose dominance of the battlefield would fundamentally reshape warfare across 3 continents and persist as a military concept for over 1,000 years. These cavalry units represented an extraordinary commitment of resources and specialized training, requiring not only exceptional horsemanship, but also the ability to maneuver while bearing the weight of scale armor, chain mail, helmets, shields, and lances that could exceed 100 pounds in total. Transforming the rider into a kind of human siege engine capable of delivering devastating charges that could shatter infantry formations and dictate the outcome of engagements through sheer concentrated force and psychological intimidation. The Sarmatians themselves eventually vanished from historical prominence, absorbed into other populations, their empire fragmented and their culture dispersed, yet the cataphract concept did not disappear with them. Instead, it was adopted and refined by Roman legions, by the Byzantine Empire, by Persian kingdoms, by medieval European nobility, and eventually by Ottoman forces, suggesting that once a particular military technology proved its effectiveness, it became nearly impossible to abandon despite requiring enormous wealth, extensive training infrastructure, and the maintenance of specialized horses and craftspeople dedicated to armor production. The persistence of heavily armored cavalry continued centuries beyond the technological developments that rendered such armor increasingly obsolete, illustrating a fundamental tendency within human institutions to maintain established military doctrines long after their practical advantages have diminished, driven by TR. Between roughly 900 and 1600 CE, one of North America's most sophisticated civilizations rose to prominence in the river valleys of the continent's interior, establishing a complex society centered around the great city of Cahokia, which at its peak around 1100 CE may have housed between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants, rivaling the largest European cities of its era. Mississippian culture, named after the river system that sustained it, developed an intricate hierarchical social structure, monumental earthwork construction, advanced agricultural practices including the cultivation of maize and beans, and an extensive trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Plains, allowing them to accumulate vast wealth and resources that manifested in the construction of enormous ceremonial mounds, some exceeding 100 feet in height, which served religious, residential, and administrative purposes. These people created a unified cultural sphere characterized by shared artistic styles, religious practices, and architectural conventions, suggesting a degree of political and ideological cohesion that spanned vast distances. Yet by the time European explorers arrived in the 16th century, this entire civilization had mysteriously collapsed and fragmented into smaller, dispersed populations, their great cities abandoned and reclaimed by forest growth, their centralized authority dissolved, and their monumental achievements left to decay unattended. The mechanisms behind this decline likely involved a combination of factors including severe climate change in the form of the Little Ice Age, which disrupted agricultural productivity and destabilized the food supplies that supported large population centers, compounded by resource depletion from intensive farming and overuse of local timber for construction and fuel, social strain from maintain. High in the Zagros Mountains of what is now southwestern Iran, there existed one of humanity's oldest and most enduring civilizations, a culture so ancient that it predates even the earliest dynasties of Sumer by centuries, yet whose name has been almost entirely erased from popular memory despite its profound influence on the ancient world. Elam flourished for nearly 3,000 years, from approximately 3200 BCE until its final conquest around 600 BCE, making it one of the longest surviving civilizations in human history. Yet today it remains virtually unknown to the general public, overshadowed entirely by the more celebrated empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Elamites developed their own writing system, their own distinct language that belonged to no known linguistic family, their own artistic traditions, and their own religious practices that reflected their unique mountainous geography and cultural identity, creating a sophisticated urban society with monumental architecture, advanced administrative systems, and extensive trade networks that connected them to civilizations across the ancient Near East. What makes Elam's disappearance from historical consciousness so remarkable is not that the civilization fell, for all empires eventually do, but rather that despite leaving behind substantial archaeological evidence, cuneiform inscriptions, architectural remains, and artistic artifacts that document their existence, they have been systematically marginalized in our collective understanding of antiquity. The psychological mechanism behind this erasure appears rooted in the Western historical tradition's overwhelming focus on Mesopotamian and Mediterranean civilizations, where the written records and archaeological investigations were more heavily concentrated during the early stages of modern archaeology, creating a self-reinforcing cycle wherein Elam's achievements, though documented, received minimal scholarly attention. And the Sogdians were a remarkable merchant civilization that flourished across Central Asia, primarily in the region between present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, from roughly the 6th century BCE until their gradual absorption into Islamic culture around the 9th and 10th centuries CE. These were not warriors or empire builders in the traditional sense, but rather skilled traders, linguists, and cultural intermediaries whose influence extended far beyond their relatively modest territorial holdings. They established themselves as indispensable middlemen along the Silk Road, controlling crucial trade routes that connected the Chinese Empire to the Persian and Byzantine worlds. The Sogdians developed sophisticated commercial networks, created their own written script, and became fluent in multiple languages including Persian, Chinese, Turkic, and Greek, which allowed them to facilitate not just the exchange of goods, but of ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs across vast distances. Their cities, particularly Samarkand and Bukhara, became legendary centers of learning, commerce, and cultural synthesis, where merchants, scholars, and adventurers from every corner of the known world converged. Yet despite their extraordinary historical significance and their role in shaping the intellectual and economic landscape of medieval Eurasia, the Sogdians gradually ceased to exist as a distinct cultural and political entity. What occurred was not a dramatic conquest or catastrophic collapse. but rather a slow cultural assimilation wherein Sogdian identity became diluted and eventually absorbed into the broader Islamic civilization that swept across Central Asia. The mechanisms behind this disappearance reveal something profound about how civilizations can vanish not through destruction but through integration. As subsequent generations adopted new religious frameworks, new languages, and new identities that rendered their ancestral heritage increasingly deep within the Horn of Africa, nestled between the highlands of what is now Eritrea and Ethiopia, there existed a kingdom whose name has echoed through the centuries as little more than a whisper among scholars and historians. The kingdom of Dian, flourishing roughly between the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, represents one of antiquity's most enigmatic civilizations, a sophisticated society that seemingly vanished from historical consciousness almost as suddenly as it emerged into the archaeological record. This ancient realm controlled crucial trade routes connecting the Red Sea to the interior African highlands, commanding tremendous wealth and influence during an era when commercial networks were beginning to reshape the known world. Archaeological evidence suggests that Dian possessed a complex administrative structure, minted its own coinage, maintained monumental architecture, and engaged in extensive trade with neighboring civilizations including ancient Egypt, South Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. Yet despite these markers of advanced civilization, Dian left remarkably few written records of its own, forcing modern scholars to piece together its history from fragmentary inscriptions, foreign accounts, and material remains scattered across the landscape. The very mechanism of Dian's disappearance appears rooted in the nature of its existence itself, a kingdom built upon controlling trade flows and maintaining strategic positions within a dynamic regional landscape. When these economic patterns shifted, when new trade routes emerged, and when rival powers rose to prominence in neighboring territories, Dian simply could not sustain itself against these transformative forces. What remains profoundly peculiar is how completely this once significant power was absorbed into historical obscurity, its achievements overshadowed by later kingdoms and empires that would rise in the same region, allowing the memory of Dian to. The Iberians were a sophisticated Mediterranean civilization that flourished across the eastern and southern regions of the Iberian Peninsula from roughly the 6th century BCE, until their gradual absorption into Roman culture following the conquest of Hispania in the 2nd century BCE. Yet their distinct identity and remarkable achievements have been almost entirely eclipsed by the more dominant narrative of Celtic peoples and Roman expansion. These settlements, which stretched from modern-day Catalonia down through Andalusia and into regions of the interior, developed complex urban centers, sophisticated trade networks, and distinctive artistic traditions that rivaled contemporary Mediterranean cultures, producing intricate bronze work, remarkable pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns, and architectural innovations that demonstrated a society of considerable organizational capability and aesthetic refinement. Archaeological evidence reveals that Iberian communities maintained robust commercial relationships with Phoenician traders, Greek colonists, and Etruscan merchants, establishing a cosmopolitan society that borrowed cultural elements from multiple sources while maintaining their own distinct identity and artistic vocabulary. The psychological mechanism underlying their historical erasure stems partly from the classical historical focus on Rome as the dominant historical force, and partly from the later European emphasis on Celtic and Germanic peoples as the supposed foundations of European identity, a framework that left little room for acknowledging the achievements of non-Indo-European Mediterranean populations who existed outside this ideological narrative. The Iberians themselves left no written historical records beyond brief inscriptions in their own script, a factor that made them dependent upon external sources for historical documentation, and this dependency meant that their story became subsumed within grander narrat. Hidden within the arid desert valleys of Peru's central coast lies Caral Soup, one of the world's oldest complex civilizations, dating back approximately 5,000 years to around 3000 BCE, making it contemporaneous with the earliest Egyptian dynasties and predating the establishment of the Norte Chico culture by centuries. This sprawling settlement, discovered only in the 1990s by archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis, encompasses an area of approximately 66 hectares and contains at least 32 distinct monumental structures, including massive stepped pyramids, sunken plazas, residential complexes, and ceremonial centers that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of architectural planning, social organization, and resource management that challenges our conventional understanding of civilization's origins in the Americas. The archaeological evidence reveals a society that cultivated cotton, beans, squash, and avocados while also exploiting rich marine resources from the nearby Pacific Ocean, suggesting an economy based on complementary ecological zones that supported a population numbering in the thousands. What makes Carol Soup so remarkable is not merely its age or architectural sophistication, but rather the profound mystery surrounding why this thriving cultural center was suddenly and completely abandoned, leaving behind its monuments intact, but its people vanished from the archaeological record, as if the civilization simply dissolved into the coastal sands without explanation or discernible cause. The mechanisms underlying such civilizational collapse remain subject to intense scholarly debate, with researchers proposing various theories including environmental degradation, shifts in marine productivity that destabilized food supplies, internal social conflict, or the voluntary relocation of populations toward more advantageous territories along the Peruvian coast. Between the 9th and 1st centuries before the Common Era, in what is now northern Vietnam, there flourished a sophisticated Bronze Age culture known as the Dong Son Civilization, named after the village where its distinctive artifacts were first discovered by French archaeologists in the early 20th century. The Dong Son people possessed remarkable metallurgical knowledge, crafting intricate bronze drums decorated with geometric patterns, scenes of ritual warfare, and images of boats that suggest a society deeply connected to maritime trade and riverine transportation. These drums, which ranged dramatically in size and weight, served purposes that extended far beyond simple musical instruments, functioning instead as status symbols, ritual objects, and repositories of cultural memory that likely accompanied ceremonies and maintained the social hierarchies that bound their communities together. The civilization's reach extended across the Red River Delta and into what is now Thailand and Laos, suggesting networks of exchange and cultural contact that demonstrate how ancient Southeast Asian societies were far from isolated, instead participating in dynamic systems of commerce and knowledge transfer that connected distant populations across monsoon routes and river networks. Yet despite leaving behind thousands of these bronze drums, extensive archaeological sites, and evidence of agricultural sophistication and artistic achievement, the Dong Son civilization declined and eventually vanished around the time of increased Chinese influence in the region, their cultural distinctiveness gradually absorbed or displaced by Han dynasties and subsequent Vietnamese kingdoms. The mechanism behind their disappearance involves the confluence of external pressure from expanding imperial powers and internal transformations as populations adapted to new political frameworks and cultural systems, a process so seamless in historical terms that the boundary between. Deep in the Mississippi River Valley, nestled in northeastern Louisiana, there exists one of North America's most perplexing archaeological mysteries, a site called Poverty Point, which flourished between approximately 3,000 and 1,600 years before the present day, representing a civilization so advanced and yet so enigmatic that its very existence challenges our understanding of pre-Columbian societies. The people who built Poverty Point constructed massive concentric earthen ridges in a pattern that could only be fully appreciated from above, arranged in a series of semicircular embankments that suggest sophisticated spatial planning and collective labor organization on a scale rarely seen in hunter-gatherer societies. These ridges, some rising up to 8 feet high and stretching across the landscape in geometric precision, contain evidence of residency spanning centuries, with thousands of individuals having occupied this settlement at what appears to be the height of its influence. Yet despite these monumental achievements and the abundance of physical evidence scattered across the site, we remain profoundly ignorant about the fundamental nature of Poverty Point society, its political structure, its cultural beliefs, and the reasons for its eventual abandonment. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Poverty Point lies in the unsettling disconnect between the undeniable evidence of sophisticated organization and our inability to reconstruct the civilization's essence, which creates a peculiar cognitive tension that draws researchers and enthusiasts into deeper investigation. We possess their artifacts, their earthworks, their refuse heaps containing thousands of stone tools and trade goods from distant regions, yet we cannot penetrate the meaning behind these objects or understand what social forces motivated such elaborate construction projects. The Jaman people represent one of the world's longest-lasting hunter-gatherer societies, flourishing across the Japanese archipelago for roughly 14,000 years before gradually fading into obscurity around 2,300 years ago. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated culture that developed sophisticated pottery with distinctive cord-marked patterns, giving the civilization its name meaning cord-marked in Japanese, and these ceramic vessels stand as some of the oldest known pottery in human history, predating similar developments in other parts of the world by thousands of years. The Jaman subsisted through hunting, fishing, and gathering rather than agriculture, utilizing an intricate knowledge of seasonal patterns and marine resources along Japan's abundant coastlines and rivers, creating stable communities that could support relatively large populations despite the absence of farming practices. Their material culture included bone and stone tools of remarkable precision, lacquerware of unexpected sophistication, and artistic expressions in the form of figurines and sculptures that suggest complex spiritual and symbolic systems. Yet paradoxically, despite these markers of advanced cultural development, the Jaman did not transition to agricultural societies until the Yayoi period arrived around 300 BCE, bringing wet rice farming and new populations from the Korean peninsula. The psychological and cultural mechanisms underlying this phenomenon relate to the remarkable sustainability of their resource-rich environment, where abundant seafood and game made the transition to agriculture economically unnecessary and potentially even disadvantageous, given the labor intensity of early farming. The Jamans demonstrated contentment with their existing systems persisted because their coastal and forest ecosystems provided sufficient caloric returns without the social stratification and hierarchical organization that agri-coup. Deep within the Nubian desert, stretching across what is now Sudan and reaching into Chad, there existed a powerful African kingdom whose name echoes through ancient Egyptian texts with a mixture of respect and wariness. The kingdom of Yam flourished during the Old Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, particularly during the 6th dynasty around 2300 BCE, representing one of the most influential civilizations south of Egypt that has since faded almost entirely from popular historical consciousness. Archaeological evidence and hieroglyphic inscriptions reveal that Yam was not a minor settlement, but rather a substantial trading power that controlled vast territories, commanded armies, and negotiated directly with pharaohs as equals. Yet remarkably little remains of its physical infrastructure or cultural legacy today. The kingdom controlled critical trade routes that channeled gold, incense, ebony, and exotic animal hides northward toward Egyptian markets, making it economically indispensable to the prosperity of the pharaonic dynasties. Egyptian expeditions launched by governors like Harkhuf documented their dangerous journeys through Yamite territory, describing encounters with powerful kings who maintained their own standing armies and could either facilitate or obstruct commerce at will, demonstrating that Yam possessed political sovereignty that early historians now struggle to fully reconstruct. The psychological mechanism behind Yam's near-total erasure from modern memory lies partly in the colonization of African history itself, whereby the documentation practices and monumental architecture of Mediterranean civilizations became the default lens through which all ancient societies are measured and preserved, while the less architecturally bombastic but equally complex administrative systems of sub-Saharan kingdoms were simply forgotten. Between roughly 200 and 800 CE, the Moche civilization flourished along the arid northern coast of Peru, constructing one of South America's most sophisticated pre-Columbian societies without ever developing a written language as we understand it. They built massive adobe pyramids, created extraordinary ceramic vessels of unparalleled artistic quality, engineered sophisticated irrigation systems across desert terrain, and maintained complex trade networks that extended hundreds of miles along the Pacific coast. Moche were master potters and sculptors whose portrait vessels captured individual human faces with almost photographic realism, yet their legacy was entirely erased from historical memory until archaeologists began excavating their sites in the early 20th century. What makes the Moche particularly enigmatic is how completely they vanished from the archaeological and cultural record despite leaving behind monumental architecture and hundreds of thousands of ceramic artifacts. The civilization's collapse appears connected to dramatic environmental changes, specifically a series of catastrophic El Niño weather events that brought unprecedented flooding followed by severe droughts, destabilizing their agricultural systems and overwhelming their carefully engineered infrastructure. Yet the psychological and cultural mechanisms that sustained Moche society for centuries proved brittle when faced with these cascading environmental crises, suggesting that civilizations dependent on environmental predictability become vulnerable when that assumption is violated. The Moche disappeared not through invasion or sudden catastrophe, but through gradual abandonment, as communities relocated inland and their distinctive cultural practices were absorbed or lost, until future generations had no memory of the sophisticated society that once dominated this coastal region, demonstrating how completely human civilizations can vanish when en. Deep within the Balkans, along the banks of the Danube River in what is now Serbia, there existed between 6,000 and 4,500 BCE a civilization so advanced, so mysteriously organized, that its sudden disappearance ranks among history's most perplexing vanishings. The Vinča culture, named after the village where its artifacts were first discovered in 1911, represents one of Europe's oldest complex societies, yet it withdrew from the historical record almost completely, leaving behind intricate figurines, sophisticated pottery, and an undeciphered writing system that predates even the famous script of ancient Sumer. Archaeological evidence reveals that Vinča settlements were remarkably large for their era, with populations potentially reaching 5,000 inhabitants or more, organized according to sophisticated urban planning that included specialized craft areas, communal storage facilities, and distinct residential zones. The people of Vinča created terracotta figurines of haunting beauty and mysterious purpose, many depicting female forms with abstract facial features, alongside an elaborate symbolic script consisting of over 700 distinct signs inscribed upon their pottery and small clay objects. The psychological mechanism behind Vinča's prominence lies in what archaeologists recognize as a crucial transitional period in human development, when agricultural societies were first experimenting with genuine urbanization, craft specialization, and symbolic record-keeping far earlier than traditional narratives suggested. Yet this civilization, which had achieved such organizational complexity and artistic refinement, simply ceased to maintain its distinctive cultural practices around 4500 BCE, with populations dispersing or assimilating into successor cultures without leaving any written explanation, mythological account, or identifiable cause for its abandonment. Between roughly 1100 and 1471 CE, the Chimu civilization flourished along the northern coast of Peru, developing one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian societies the Americas had ever known, and yet their entire empire would be systematically dismantled and absorbed into the Inca sphere of influence, leaving behind only archaeological fragments and the fading memory of their remarkable achievements. The Chimu had constructed an intricate network of settlements, irrigation systems, and administrative centers that stretched across hundreds of miles of coastal desert, creating a state that rivaled even the Inca in organizational complexity and artistic sophistication. Yet their cultural identity would be deliberately suppressed and eventually erased from historical prominence. What makes the Chimu disappearance particularly striking is not that they vanished entirely, but rather that they were conquered, assimilated, and rendered invisible within the broader narrative of Andean civilization, their distinct customs, language, and administrative practices subordinated to Inca dominance. The Inca conquest of Chimu territories between 1460 and 1470 CE did not involve genocide or apocalyptic collapse, but rather a methodical process of cultural absorption wherein Chimu nobility was either incorporated into the Inca elite or relocated, their craft traditions were appropriated, and their very identity was subsumed under imperial ideology. This pattern reflects a broader psychological mechanism wherein dominant civilizations systematically rewrite history to consolidate their authority, making conquered peoples appear as mere precursors to their own greatness rather than as independent actors deserving of recognition. The Akkadian Empire emerged around 24th century before the Common Era in ancient Mesopotamia, rising to prominence under the leadership of Sargon of Akkad, a figure whose ascent from humble origins to imperial dominion remains one of history's most compelling narratives of ambition and military innovation. Sargon, originally a cupbearer to the king of Kish, orchestrated a remarkable coup that allowed him to consolidate control over the city-states of Mesopotamia, creating what many historians consider the world's first multi-ethnic empire spanning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The Akkadians, a Semitic people who had gradually infiltrated and settled among the dominant Sumerian population, brought with them a distinct language, cultural practices, and organizational systems that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of the ancient Near East during a period spanning roughly 2 centuries. What made the Akkadian Empire particularly significant was not merely its territorial extent, but rather its revolutionary approach to centralized administration and military organization. Sargon established what is widely recognized as one of history's earliest standing armies, composed of professional soldiers who answered directly to the crown rather than to local civic authorities, thereby creating a new model of state power that prioritized unified command and bureaucratic efficiency. The empire's success rested fundamentally upon this innovation, the psychological and organizational breakthrough that allowed a single authority to project consistent force across vast distances and diverse populations, transforming loose confederations of city-states into a cohesive imperial structure governed by appointed officials rather than hereditary local rulers. However, the Akkadian Empire's dominion proved remarkably fragile despite its apparent military strength and administrative sophistication. Between the 1st and 11th centuries, in what is now Myanmar, a sophisticated network of city-states known as the Pyu Civilization flourished in the fertile plains and river valleys of Southeast Asia, developing advanced urban centers, intricate irrigation systems, and a complex society that rivaled contemporary kingdoms across Asia. Archaeological evidence reveals that Pyu cities such as Baekthano, Halin, and Thagara were carefully planned metropolises complete with defensive walls, Buddhist temples, and residential quarters organized in grid patterns, suggesting a people governed by principles of order and systematic urban planning that demonstrate intellectual sophistication comparable to their Chinese, Indian, and Southeast Asian contemporaries. The Pyu people, whose origins remain debated among scholars, but who likely migrated from the Tibetan plateau, established themselves as skilled agriculturalists and traders, cultivating rice through advanced hydraulic engineering while simultaneously participating in the maritime trade networks that connected the Indian Ocean world to the distant courts of China. They adopted Buddhism and Sanskrit-influenced writing systems, created distinctive terracotta figurines and artistic traditions, minted coins bearing inscriptions in their own language, and maintained diplomatic relationships with powerful neighboring states and distant empires, leaving behind a cultural legacy that would profoundly influence the development of later Burmese civilization. Yet by the 11th century, these thriving urban centers were systematically abandoned, their populations dispersed or absorbed, their cities reclaimed by jungle vegetation and forgotten by history for nearly 1,000 years, until modern archaeologists began excavating their remains. In the southeastern region of Iran, within the dramatic landscape of the Kerman province, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that flourished between approximately 3000 and 2500 BCE, yet remains virtually unknown to the wider world. The Jiroft Civilization, named after the city near which its artifacts were discovered, represents one of the most significant archaeological finds of the past few decades, yet it languishes in obscurity, overshadowed by more famous contemporary cultures like the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. The civilization emerged in the Hallow River Valley, where a people developed an intricate society characterized by monumental architecture, advanced irrigation systems, and distinctive artistic traditions that suggest complex social hierarchies and long-distance trade networks. The most remarkable evidence of their existence comes in the form of elaborately carved soapstone vessels decorated with intricate geometric patterns, mythological figures, and scenes of hunting and ritual, artifacts that demonstrate a level of craftsmanship and cultural sophistication that rivals any contemporaneous civilization. Yet the Jiroft culture vanished from the archaeological record around 2500 BCE, leaving behind only their artifacts and the physical remnants of their settlements, their collapse occurring without clear explanation. The fundamental mechanism behind our collective amnesia regarding Jiroft appears to rooted in the simple geography of historical attention. Civilizations located along more traveled trade routes and situated within regions that experienced continuous cultural development became woven into documented histories, while those emerging in geographically marginal or geopolitically unstable regions faded from collective memory. The Chavin civilization emerged in the Andean highlands of what is now Peru around 900 BCE, establishing itself as one of South America's earliest complex societies. Yet by 400 BCE, this influential culture had mysteriously dissolved into obscurity, leaving behind only archaeological puzzles and monumental stone structures that hint at a sophistication that seemed to vanish almost overnight. The Chavin people developed an elaborate religious and artistic system centered around their principal temple at Chavin de Huenter, a massive stone structure built with extraordinary precision at high altitude, suggesting advanced architectural knowledge and organizational capability that unified disparate mountain communities under a shared spiritual ideology. Their influence spread across vast territories, connecting coastal and highland regions through trade networks and religious fervor. Yet despite this widespread cultural dominance and the physical permanence of their stone monuments, the civilization that created this system simply ceased to maintain its cohesion, fragmenting back into regional autonomy as mysteriously as it had consolidated. The psychological mechanism underlying the Chavin's influence lay in their ability to synthesize local religious beliefs into a unifying mythology centered on a powerful feline deity, perhaps a jaguar or puma, which resonated across diverse populations and created a shared identity that transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. This religious syncretism functioned as an invisible architecture holding together a civilization that lacked the centralized political bureaucracy that would later characterize the Inca Empire, instead relying entirely on the spiritual authority of their priesthood and the compelling power of their artistic and religious iconography. The Median Empire stands as one of history's most paradoxical civilizations, a vast and influential power that dominated the ancient Near East for nearly 2 centuries before being almost completely absorbed into the Persian Empire, leaving behind fragmented historical records that make its true extent difficult to comprehend. Emerging around the 7th century BCE in what is now northwestern Iran, the Medians established themselves as a formidable force through military prowess and political organization, eventually controlling territories that stretched from the Caspian Sea to Mesopotamia. Yet their civilization left so little distinct archaeological evidence that modern scholars struggle to separate Median achievements from those of their Persian successors. The psychological mechanism underlying this historical invisibility stems from the simple fact that the Persians who conquered and incorporated Median territories were far more sophisticated in their record-keeping and cultural documentation, consciously or unconsciously absorbing Median traditions, administrative practices, and religious concepts into their own expanding empire. What we know of the Medians comes largely through the writings of Greek historians like Herodotus, whose accounts were themselves often filtered through Persian perspectives and Greek biases, creating a distorted lens through which we view this civilization that once rivaled and eventually merged with Persia under rulers like Cyrus the Great. The Medians developed an advanced feudal system with regional governors and a complex military structure that would later influence Persian organizational methods. Yet because these innovations were adopted and refined by the Persians rather than remaining distinctly Median, they became associated with Persian ingenuity rather than Median creativity. Deep within the Darien region of Panama, nestled between dense rainforest and river valleys that time seems to have forgotten, lies the archaeological site of Sitio Conte, a civilization that flourished between roughly 1,000 and 1,500 years ago before vanishing almost entirely from historical memory. The site was first discovered by accident in 1927 when a flood exposed ceramic vessels and golden artifacts of extraordinary craftsmanship, revealing a sophisticated pre-Columbian society that had developed complex trade networks, hierarchical social structures, and an artistic tradition of remarkable refinement. The Conte people, as archaeologists refer to them, created intricate polychrome pottery featuring elaborate geometric patterns and zoomorphic designs, crafted sophisticated gold and copper ornaments that demonstrate mastery of metallurgical techniques, and constructed burial mounds that served as repositories for their elite dead, each interred with provisions and prestige goods, suggesting deeply held spiritual beliefs about the afterlife and social distinction. Yet within a few centuries, this culture simply ceased to exist as a recognizable archaeological entity, leaving behind only scattered remnants and unanswered questions about what caused their civilization's sudden disappearance from the archaeological record. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Sitio Conte centers on the profound human discomfort with incompleteness and mystery, for we possess clear evidence that a sophisticated people once thrived here, creating objects of beauty and utility, yet we cannot definitively explain why they abandoned their territories or merged with neighboring populations or succumbed to environmental or social pressures. In the harsh deserts and river valleys of what is now Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, between roughly 2300 and 1800 BCE, there flourished one of the Bronze Age world's most sophisticated yet enigmatic civilizations, a culture so advanced and so carefully organized that its sudden disappearance remains one of archaeology's most perplexing mysteries. The Bactrian-Margiana archaeological complex, as modern scholars call it, represented a remarkable achievement in urban planning, agricultural innovation, and social organization, with evidence suggesting a population that had developed fortified settlements, an extensive trade network spanning from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, and a complex belief system reflected in their monumental architecture and ritualistic practices. Yet despite possessing the hallmarks of a thriving civilization with every apparent advantage for continued existence, this culture simply ceased to exist over the course of several centuries, leaving behind only fragmentary ruins and unanswered questions about what became of its people, its knowledge, and its distinctive way of life. The mechanism underlying Bactrian-Margiana's decline appears rooted in the vulnerability of civilizations dependent upon precise environmental conditions and long-distance trade networks, as evidence points toward a combination of catastrophic climate change that disrupted the region's delicate water systems, the collapse of trade routes that had sustained their economy, possible invasions by Indo-European peoples from the north, and internal social fractures that may have undermined their institutional cohesion when external pressures mounted. What proves psychologically remarkable about this civilization's disappearance is how completely it was forgotten, erased from historical memory so thoroughly that classical Greek and later Islamic scholars made no mention of it, suggesting that the discontinuity was so profound. Before Columbus ever set foot in the Caribbean, a sophisticated civilization thrived across the islands of the Greater Antilles, including present-day Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. The Taino people, whose name meant people of the good face, had developed an intricate society characterized by agricultural mastery, complex social hierarchies, and artistic achievements that reflected centuries of cultural refinement. They cultivated cassava, sweet potatoes, and maize using advanced farming techniques adapted to island environments, built villages called ukieks organized around central plazas, and created elaborate wooden sculptures and petroglyphs that revealed a deep spiritual understanding of their world. Their population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps exceeding 3 million across the Caribbean archipelago, and they had established trade networks spanning hundreds of miles of ocean, using sophisticated canoe technology to navigate between islands and maintain cultural contact. The Taino possessed a remarkable knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and navigation, along with a governance structure that balanced chieftain authority with communal decision-making processes. Yet within a single century of European arrival in 1492, this entire civilization essentially ceased to exist as a distinct people. The mechanisms of their disappearance operated across multiple devastating vectors simultaneously. The introduction of European diseases to which they had no immunity, systemic violence and warfare imposed by conquistadors, the deliberate enslavement and forced labor in mines and plantations that decimated populations, and the cultural erasure through forced assimilation and religious conversion. What makes the Taino case particularly striking is how completely their vanishing was normalized and forgotten by subsequent history, their contributions obscured beneath narratives of exploration and In the vast expanse of the Nile Valley, between the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile in what is now Sudan, there existed a powerful medieval kingdom known as Alodia that flourished for nearly 1,000 years before vanishing almost entirely from historical consciousness. This Christian kingdom, which emerged around the 6th century and endured until the 15th century, occupied a crucial geographical position between the more famous kingdoms of Kush and Nubia to its north and the untamed regions of the southern Nile to its south. Alodia was a thriving center of trade, agriculture, and Christian faith, with a sophisticated administrative system that allowed it to maintain considerable wealth and influence across the African continent. The kingdom's people engaged in extensive commerce with distant lands, trading ivory, gold, and precious goods through vast networks that connected them to Mediterranean civilizations and beyond. Yet despite this prominence and the centuries during which it held sway over its territories, Alodia has become almost entirely obscured from popular historical narratives and academic discourse, relegated to footnotes in discussions of African history. The psychological mechanism underlying this erasure stems from the fundamental reality that the kingdom of Alodia lacked the monumental archaeological footprint that characterizes our typical understanding of historical significance. Without the towering pyramids, the elaborate temple complexes, or the preserved written records in widely recognized languages, subsequent generations found little reason to maintain Alodia's memory in the collective consciousness. The kingdom's Christian heritage, while culturally significant, could not compete with the romantic appeal of ancient Egypt or the dramatic narratives of Islamic expansion that consumed historical attention. Deep within the arid valleys of Peru's far north, between roughly 800 and 1400 CE, there flourished a civilization whose wealth was so legendary that Spanish conquistadors centuries later would still speak of it in hushed, reverent tones. The Sican, whose name means Temple of the Moon in the Mochica language, dominated the Lambayeque Valley and surrounding regions through an extraordinary command of metallurgy and trade networks that stretched across South America's Pacific coast. Their settlements, particularly the monumental city of Baton Grande, featured massive adobe pyramids, sophisticated irrigation systems, and residential complexes that housed thousands of skilled artisans and administrators who worked tirelessly to produce the civilization's most celebrated export. Objects of pure gold that were so expertly crafted they seemed almost supernatural in their perfection. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Sican people developed advanced techniques for working with gold, silver, and copper alloys, creating intricate masks, vessels, and religious ornaments that demonstrated not merely technical skill, but a profound spiritual understanding of these precious materials as conduits between the earthly and divine realms. The civilization's psychological foundation rested upon a hierarchical religious system centered around the worship of the moon and Sican, a powerful deity who appeared in their art as a fanged, bird-headed figure symbolizing the intersection of sky and earth, sky and sea. The Sican believed that their elaborate metalwork and monumental architecture pleased these deities and ensured the continuation of seasonal rains essential for their survival in one of the world's driest environments. Yet despite their obvious sophistication, their technological achievements, and their apparent religious certainty, the Sican civilization began a gradual decline around 1300 CE, possibly accelerated by catastrophe. Between the 1st and 6th centuries of the Common Era, there existed in Southeast Asia a maritime trading empire known as Funan, a civilization that would leave virtually no trace in the archaeological record despite controlling some of the most economically vital sea routes of the ancient world. Funan emerged in the Mekong Delta region, spanning what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia, and its power derived not from monumental architecture or military conquest, but from its strategic position as an intermediary between Indian and Chinese commerce, a role that made it extraordinarily wealthy yet remarkably invisible to posterity. The kingdom thrived by facilitating the exchange of goods between these two colossal civilizations, moving spices, silks, and luxury items across maritime networks, accumulating vast riches that allowed its rulers to sponsor Hindu and Buddhist temples and monuments that would eventually crumble into the jungle. Funan's invisibility stems from a fundamental paradox in how we measure civilization itself, for we tend to valorize the monumental and the permanent, the grand stone temples and elaborate written records, yet Funan's strength lay in its fluidity, its adaptability, and its mercantile sophistication rather than in stone and script. The kingdom gradually absorbed influences from India through trade, adopting Sanskrit, Hindu deities, and sophisticated administrative practices. but it did so without creating the kinds of permanent records that would survive millennia, instead leaving only scattered references in Chinese chronicles and fragmentary archaeological remains that scholars must painstakingly interpret. By the 6th century, Funan's dominance waned as regional powers rose and maritime trade routes shifted, and the civilization simply transitioned into successor states without cataclysm or collapse, making its disappearance not a dramatic vanishing, but rather a gradual transformation so subtle that later gen. In the Arctic reaches of North America, spanning from what is now Alaska eastward across Canada and into Greenland, there existed for nearly 2,000 years a sophisticated maritime culture whose name we have nearly lost to time itself. The Dorset people, as archaeologists have named them based on discoveries at Cape Dorset in the Canadian Arctic, developed an extraordinary adaptation to one of Earth's most hostile environments, thriving in extreme cold and isolation where few human societies could survive. Yet around the 15th century, this entire civilization vanished almost completely, leaving behind only scattered artifacts, bone tools, intricate carvings, and the perplexing question of what became of them. The Dorset culture emerged roughly around the year 500 before the Common Era, representing an evolution from earlier Paleo-Eskimo populations, and they mastered a way of life centered entirely on hunting seal, walrus, and whale from the frozen Arctic Ocean. They were not merely survivors but innovators, developing sophisticated harpoon technology, creating toggle harpoon heads that would revolutionize maritime hunting, and fashioning intricate bone and ivory carvings that suggest a rich artistic and spiritual life in the darkness of Arctic winters. Their settlements were small and mobile, following the seasonal patterns of marine mammals and adapting their architecture and tools to the demands of perpetual ice and snow. The psychological mechanism underlying their success lay in a remarkable cognitive flexibility, combined with intimate ecological knowledge accumulated over countless generations. The Dorset people understood their environment with such precision that they could predict animal migrations, interpret ice conditions, and manufacture tools perfectly suited to specific hunting contexts, demonstrating that human ingenuity could match itself against extreme geography through patient observation and cultural memo. In the remote deserts of Afghanistan, rising from the barren landscape near the city of Ghazni, stands an archaeological site known as Turquoise Mountain, a place that represents one of the most sophisticated and deliberately concealed civilizations of the medieval Islamic world. This settlement, which flourished during the 12th century under the patronage of the Yayoi Dynasty, was a thriving center of art, commerce, and craftsmanship that mysteriously vanished from historical records and collective memory for nearly 8 centuries. The site itself reveals an extraordinarily advanced urban planning system, with carefully constructed buildings, intricate pottery workshops, glass-making facilities, and evidence of a complex administrative hierarchy that suggests a population in the thousands at its peak. Archaeological excavations have uncovered artifacts of stunning beauty and technical sophistication, including turquoise inlays, ceramic vessels of exceptional quality, and architectural remnants that demonstrate knowledge of advanced construction techniques and aesthetic refinement that rivaled contemporary European and Asian centers of culture. The mechanism behind Turquoise Mountain's disappearance from historical consciousness lies partly in the natural disasters and military invasions that disrupted the region, but more fundamentally in the way historical narratives have been selectively preserved and transmitted through dominant centers of power and documentation. The site was gradually buried beneath desert sands and layers of cultural memory, becoming invisible to scholars and historians who focused their attention on more readily accessible and politically relevant civilizations. What remains particularly striking is how this sophisticated urban center, once the home to thousands of skilled artisans and merchants whose work circulated throughout Asia and beyond, has been almost entirely absent from conventional histories of Islami. In the harsh interior plateaus of the Iberian Peninsula, where scorching summers gave way to brutal winters, there emerged a warrior culture that would define an entire epoch of ancient European history. The Celtiberians were a fusion of Celtic and Iberian peoples who, between roughly the 6th and 1st centuries before the Common Era, established themselves as formidable military powers in what we now call central Spain. These were not unified kingdoms or empires in the traditional sense, but rather loose confederations of warrior tribes bound together by shared cultural practices, religious beliefs, and a profound commitment to martial honor that permeated every aspect of their society. Archaeological evidence reveals that their settlements, built upon defensible hilltops and fortified positions, reflected a people perpetually prepared for conflict, yet simultaneously engaged in sophisticated trade networks that connected them to Mediterranean civilizations and beyond. The Celtiberians became legendary throughout the ancient world not merely for their combat prowess, but for their unwavering commitment to a cultural ideal in which death held greater value than subjugation. This philosophy would ultimately prove inseparable from their civilization's decline, as Roman legions, advancing relentlessly across Iberia during the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, encountered warriors willing to choose mass suicide over conquest. The most famous instance occurred at Numantia in 133 before the Common Era, where thousands of inhabitants chose collective death rather than surrender to Roman siege forces. What made the Celtiberians unique was not merely their existence as warriors, but their codification of honor into an entire social and spiritual framework that made compromise impossible, and made their eventual absorption into Roman civilization feel less like integration and more like erasure, gradually dissolving. In the Zarafshan Valley of Tajikistan, nestled between the towering peaks of Central Asia, lies the archaeological site of Sarazm, one of the world's earliest urban settlements that emerged around 4,000 years before the classical civilizations we typically recognize in textbooks. This ancient city, whose name derives from the Persian word's meaning, at the beginning, represents a sophistication in planning and construction that challenges our assumptions about the developmental trajectory of human civilization. Yet it remains virtually unknown outside academic circles despite housing evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, extensive trade networks, and complex social hierarchies that rival contemporary developments along the Indus Valley and Mesopotamian regions. The settlement flourished during the Bronze Age, specifically between approximately 3000 and 2400 BCE, serving as a crucial nexus for trade routes that connected the mineral-rich highlands of the Pamir Mountains with distant markets. Yet its gradual abandonment occurred not through catastrophic collapse, but through a slow, methodical retreat that suggests environmental stress, shifting trade patterns, or resource depletion rather than dramatic invasion or conquest. Archaeologists excavating the site have uncovered multi-story residential structures with advanced drainage systems, evidence of large-scale copper smelting operations that produced surplus goods for export, and artifacts from regions as far-flung as the Arabian Peninsula and the Indus Valley. Painting a portrait of cosmopolitan exchange and technological prowess that reminds us how easily sophisticated ancient societies can vanish from collective memory when their achievements occur in geographically peripheral regions by our modern standards. Deep within the mountainous regions of Central Asia, between the 8th and 11th centuries, there existed a sophisticated trading culture known as the Karolans, a people whose mastery of commerce and cultural synthesis allowed them to thrive at the intersection of multiple great civilizations. The Karolans were neither conquerors nor the builders of monumental architecture in the traditional sense, but rather merchants and cultural intermediaries who established networks connecting the Persian empires to the east with the Byzantine worlds to the west, creating a unique hybrid civilization that borrowed liberally from the traditions surrounding them while maintaining their own distinct identity. Archaeological evidence suggests they occupied a series of interconnected settlements in high-altitude valleys, creating irrigation systems and agricultural innovations adapted specifically to their challenging terrain, supporting populations that engaged not primarily in agriculture, but in the movement and exchange of goods, knowledge, and artistic traditions across the Silk Road's lesser-known passages. What made the Karolans psychologically unique was their extraordinary capacity for cultural adaptation without cultural dissolution, meaning they could adopt the religious practices, artistic styles, and administrative systems of neighboring powers while somehow maintaining an internal coherence that kept them recognizably Karolan. This psychological mechanism likely stemmed from a foundational belief system that viewed cultural elements as tools rather than identity markers, allowing them to function smoothly within multiple spheres of influence simultaneously without experiencing the existential threat that typically accompanies such cultural flexibility in other societies. Between approximately 300 BCE and 300 CE, the Japanese archipelago experienced a transformative period known as the Yayoi Culture, named after the Tokyo district, where its distinctive pottery was first discovered in the early 20th century. And this remarkable civilization seems to have largely vanished from popular consciousness, despite fundamentally reshaping the genetic, technological, and social landscape of Japan. The Yayoi people, who migrated from mainland Asia through the Korean peninsula, brought with them revolutionary agricultural techniques, including wet rice cultivation, bronze and iron metallurgy, and a more hierarchical social organization that gradually displaced or absorbed the preceding Jaman hunter-gatherer culture that had thrived for over 10,000 years. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Yayoi were sophisticated farmers who constructed elaborate irrigation systems, created weapons and tools from bronze and iron simultaneously rather than progressing through separate ages, and established trade networks that connected them to continental Asia. Yet their cultural memory has been eclipsed by the more glamorous samurai traditions and the Kofun period that followed. The psychological mechanism behind this historical erasure lies partly in how civilizations tend to valorize military prowess and aristocratic complexity over agricultural and technological foundations, and partly in how the Yayoi gradually transformed into what would become classical Japanese culture so seamlessly that there appears no clear rupture point, no dramatic collapse or invasion that would cement them in historical narrative. The Yayoi did not vanish catastrophically, but rather evolved and integrated so thoroughly with subsequent cultures that their distinct identity dissolved into the continuum of Japanese history, and we have unconsciously accepted this narrative transition as natural and inevitable, failing to recognize The Lusitanians were an Iberian people who inhabited the western regions of the Iberian Peninsula, primarily in what is now Portugal, during the final centuries before Roman conquest, and their civilization represents one of history's most compelling examples of cultural resistance followed by complete assimilation and erasure. These fierce warriors maintained their independence and distinct cultural identity through the 2nd century BCE, resisting the inexorable expansion of Rome with a tenacity that earned them considerable respect even from their conquerors. Yet within generations of their final military defeat, their language, religious practices, and social structures vanished almost entirely into the dominant Roman framework. The Lusitanians were organized into numerous tribal groups rather than a unified state, which paradoxically both strengthened their resilience through decentralized resistance and ultimately weakened their ability to mount sustained, coordinated defense against Roman legions, and their economy centered on pastoral herding, small-scale agriculture, and the exploitation of mineral resources that made their territories valuable to Rome. The psychological mechanism underlying their eventual disappearance lay in the Roman system of cultural integration through administrative incorporation, military service, and gradual Latinization. Processes that were not explicitly destructive but rather absorptive, transforming Lusitanian warriors into auxiliary troops, their children into Latin speakers, and their priests into practitioners of Roman religion, until the original identity became increasingly difficult to maintain or even recognize. What makes the Lusitanians particularly striking among forgotten civilizations is how thoroughly they were absorbed rather than eliminated, how their descendants became Romans without any formal decree mandating such transformation, and how the distinctive Lusitanian perspective on warfare, in the vast expanse of northeastern Africa, along the middle reaches of the Nile River in what is now Sudan, there flourished between approximately the 4th and 15th centuries a kingdom of considerable sophistication and cultural achievement that has been almost entirely erased from popular historical consciousness, despite its significant role in shaping the medieval world. Makuria emerged from the remnants of the Kushite civilization and grew to become one of the most powerful states in Africa, controlling crucial trade routes, maintaining a complex bureaucratic system, and preserving Christian faith in a region that would eventually be overwhelmed by Islamic expansion. The kingdom stretched across vast territories, with its capital initially at Napata before moving to Meroe and later to more northerly settlements, and its people developed a distinctive culture that blended African, Greek, and Arabian influences into something entirely unique. Yet today, Makuria remains virtually unknown to the general public, overshadowed by more famous ancient civilizations and erased from the historical memory of most educational systems despite possessing architectural monuments, written records, and archaeological evidence that rivals contemporary European and Asian societies. The psychological mechanism behind this erasure appears rooted in the fundamental structure of how Western historical narratives prioritize certain civilizations over others, creating an invisible hierarchy where Mediterranean and European cultures receive disproportionate attention, while African kingdoms, regardless of their actual historical importance, are systematized into footnotes or omitted entirely from mainstream discourse. This pattern of selective memory persists remarkably despite our modern claims to comprehensive historical education and multicultural awareness, suggesting that the normalization of certain historical blind spots operates at such a deep level within our ed. Between approximately 1,500 years ago and 700 years ago, a sophisticated civilization flourished across the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau regions of what is now the western United States, leaving behind remarkable evidence of their existence in the form of distinctive pottery, intricate rock art, and agricultural innovations that would perplex archaeologists for centuries to come. The Fremont people, named after the Fremont River in Utah, where their artifacts were first systematically studied, developed a unique cultural identity that blended hunting and gathering traditions with increasingly sophisticated farming techniques, allowing them to thrive in one of North America's most challenging environments. What makes the Fremont particularly enigmatic is not merely their material accomplishments, but rather the psychological and social mechanisms that allowed them to maintain such a complex society across such vast and fragmented territories, unified not by centralized political authority, but by shared artistic traditions, trade networks, and cultural practices that somehow transcended geographical isolation. Their distinctive one-handed metates for grinding seeds, their peculiar clay figurines with distinctive headdresses, and their haunting humanoid petroglyphs suggest a culture deeply invested in symbolic expression and ritual practice, indicating that their civilization functioned on principles of meaning-making and shared worldview rather than hierarchical control. Yet by roughly 700 years ago, this entire cultural network vanished with startling completeness, their settlements abandoned, their artistic traditions ceasing abruptly, leaving archaeologists to grapple with theories ranging from severe drought and climate change to cultural assimilation with neighboring groups or fundamental shifts in social organization that rendered their previous way of life unsustainable, though no single explan. Nestled in the Yangtze River Delta region of what is now Zhejiang Province in eastern China, the Liangzhu culture flourished between approximately 5,300 and 4,500 years ago, representing one of the most sophisticated and mysterious civilizations of ancient East Asia that would eventually vanish almost entirely from the historical record, leaving behind only archaeological fragments and haunting questions about its sudden collapse. The people of Liangzhu developed an extraordinarily advanced society for their time, constructing massive earthen and wooden fortifications that stretched for miles, demonstrating engineering prowess that rivaled or exceeded contemporary civilizations elsewhere in the world. Yet this impressive cultural achievement somehow faded into obscurity, forgotten by subsequent generations who would inhabit the same lands. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Liangzhu people possessed a complex hierarchical social structure with distinct classes, created intricate jade artifacts of breathtaking artistry and religious significance, and established extensive trade networks that connected them to distant regions, suggesting a civilization of considerable sophistication and ambition. The mechanism underlying their disappearance appears rooted in catastrophic environmental change, particularly dramatic climate shifts and potentially devastating floods that would have fundamentally disrupted agricultural systems upon which their densely populated settlements depended, creating cascading failures in food production and social cohesion. Yet what remains psychologically striking is how thoroughly they vanished from cultural memory, their achievements erased so completely that even neighboring civilizations seem to possess no inherited knowledge of this once thriving society, as though an entire chapter of human progress had been deliberately removed from consciousness. In the harsh deserts of what is now Arizona, between roughly 300 BCE and 1450 CE, there flourished one of North America's most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations, the Hohokam, whose name itself means "those who have gone" in the Wadam language, a fitting designation for a people who seemingly vanished without definitive explanation. The Hohokam developed an extraordinary network of irrigation canals stretching hundreds of miles through the Sonoran Desert, demonstrating hydraulic engineering capabilities that rivals anything constructed by their contemporaries in Mesoamerica, and these canals allowed them to cultivate crops in an environment that should have been virtually uninhabitable. Supporting population centers like Snaketown and Casa Grande that housed thousands of people, and served as crucial nodes in long-distance trade networks that extended from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Archaeological evidence reveals a civilization that produced elaborate ball courts modeled after those found in Mesoamerica, created intricate pottery with geometric designs, worked with cotton and shell to produce jewelry and ornaments, and developed a complex social hierarchy evidenced by the construction of massive earthen mounds and platform structures that required substantial community labor and coordination. The psychological mechanism that allowed the Hohokam to thrive in such an inhospitable landscape was their ability to perceive possibility where others saw only limitation, to view the desert's water sources not as scarce, but as resources waiting to be harnessed through collective ingenuity and sustained effort, a perspective that required both sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge and an unwavering faith that such massive infrastructural investments would yield returns across generations. Between the 3rd century BCE and the 11th century CE, the Gandhara civilization flourished in the region spanning modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, creating one of history's most artistically sophisticated and culturally influential societies that would eventually fade into obscurity despite its monumental contributions to world culture. Positioned along the trade routes connecting Central Asia with the Indian subcontinent, Gandhara served as a crucial crossroads where Hellenistic Greek influences, Persian traditions, Buddhist philosophy, and Indian artistic sensibilities converged in an unprecedented cultural synthesis that produced some of antiquity's most remarkable sculptural achievements and architectural monuments. The civilization developed a distinctive artistic style known as Gandhara art, which represented Buddha and other religious figures in human form for the first time, blending Greek sculptural techniques with Buddhist iconography to create a visual language that would influence artistic traditions across Asia for centuries to come. This remarkable fusion emerged not from deliberate planning, but from the natural collision of conquests and trade, particularly following Alexander the Great's campaigns, which left Greek settlements and cultural imprints that persisted long after his armies departed, creating a unique environment where artistic experimentation flourished. The psychological mechanism underlying Gandhara's cultural brilliance was rooted in creative necessity, as artists and scholars drew from multiple traditions simultaneously because no single cultural framework could adequately express the spiritual and aesthetic aspirations they collectively possessed, forcing them toward innovation through synthesis. Yet despite these extraordinary achievements, Gandhara gradually dissolved as a distinct civilization due to a combination of political fragmentation, repeated invasions from the north, the rise of Islamic. Deep within the Mediterranean archipelago of the Balearic Islands, between roughly 1500 and 800 BCE, there flourished a Bronze Age civilization that left behind some of the most distinctive and perplexing architectural monuments in European prehistory. The Talaiotic culture, named after the massive stone tower structures called taliots that dominate the landscape of Majorca and Menorca, developed in relative isolation from mainland Mediterranean societies, creating a unique cultural identity expressed through monumental construction, defensive positioning, and territorial organization. These people built sprawling settlements organized around central defensive towers, constructed intricate communal structures for gathering and ritual purposes, and developed sophisticated agricultural and pastoral systems suited to their island environment. Yet despite leaving behind abundant archaeological evidence of their daily lives, their stone monuments, their pottery, and their settlement patterns, the Talaiotic people vanished from history with remarkable completeness, leaving future generations with more questions than answers about who they were and why their distinctive civilization simply ceased to exist. The psychological mechanism underlying this cultural erasure stems from the fundamental challenge of oral histories and material culture without written records. The Talaiotic people created an impressive architectural legacy, but left no surviving written language or linguistic tradition that would allow them to speak directly across the centuries, making their civilization peculiarly vulnerable to historical forgetting despite the permanence of their stone structures. We have normalized this absence so thoroughly that we pass through centuries of Mediterranean history without acknowledging that an entire sophisticated civilization once thrived in these islands, their talyaots standing as silent monuments to a people whose. Deep within the mountains of what is now Yunnan province in southwestern China, a sophisticated civilization flourished for nearly 2,000 years before fading almost entirely from historical consciousness, leaving behind only fragmentary accounts and tantalizing archaeological evidence that hint at a once powerful kingdom that rivaled its more famous contemporaries. The Dian Kingdom, which existed from approximately the 5th century BCE until its conquest by the Han Dynasty around the 1st century BCE, developed in the remote highlands surrounding Dianchi Lake, where a unique culture blended indigenous traditions with influences from the broader Asian world, creating a distinctive society that produced remarkable bronze work, intricate weaponry, and complex social hierarchies that archaeologists are still struggling to fully understand. The people of Dian were known throughout ancient Asia for their extraordinary metallurgical skills, particularly their ability to craft bronze drums, vessels, and ceremonial objects of breathtaking artistry and technical sophistication. Yet their achievements remained largely invisible to the dominant Han Chinese historical narrative, which viewed the southwestern frontier as a peripheral region inhabited by lesser peoples unworthy of detailed documentation. This archaeological erasure occurred not because the Dian Kingdom lacked significance or accomplishment, but rather because their written language remains undeciphered, their oral traditions were displaced by Han conquest, and the geographical remoteness of their homeland meant that fewer Chinese historians and traveling scholars encountered their civilization during its flourishing period. The mechanism behind this forgetting demonstrates how historical visibility depends fundamentally on who controls the written record and whose narrative frameworks become accepted as the authoritative version of the past, a process wherein cultures that lack powerful Along the arid Pacific coast of what is now northern Chile and southern Peru, between approximately 7,000 and 3,500 years ago, there existed a maritime culture known as the Chinchorro, whose relationship with death and the human body fundamentally transformed our understanding of mortuary practices in the ancient world. The Chinchorro people were not monumental builders or empire creators. They were fishermen and gatherers who subsisted along one of the world's driest coastlines, yet they developed an elaborate and haunting practice of mummification that predates Egyptian mummification by thousands of years, making them the earliest known practitioners of this sacred art. What distinguishes the Chinchorro mummification process is not merely its antiquity, but its systematic methodology and the democratization of the practice across their entire society, suggesting that preserving the dead was not a privilege reserved for elite individuals, but rather a communal obligation that bound their culture together through shared ritual and spiritual commitment. The Chinchorro would carefully disarticulate the bodies of their deceased, remove the internal organs, and treat the remains with ochre and other preservatives before reconstructing the skeleton with wooden or reed supports, creating artificial mummies that were then dressed in wigs, painted masks, and elaborate garments that transformed them into idealized representations of the living rather than mere corpses. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice appears rooted in a profound belief that death represented not an ending, but a transformation requiring active participation and preparation, a concept fundamentally different from viewing mortality as inevitable decay. And in this worldview, the mummified ancestor became a tangible connection between the living community and the spiritual realm, serving as an intermediary whose preserved form ensured continue. The Unetice culture emerged across Central Europe during the early Bronze Age, flourishing roughly between 2300 and 1600 BCE across territories that would become modern-day Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, and Austria, representing one of the earliest widespread metallurgical societies in the continental European archaeological record. This civilization left behind distinctive material evidence including copper and bronze artifacts, peculiar pottery styles with characteristic cord-marked surfaces, and carefully constructed burial mounds that contained grave goods suggesting elaborate social hierarchies and trade networks extending across remarkably vast distances. The Unetice people developed sophisticated metalworking techniques that allowed them to produce daggers, axes, and ornamental items of increasing complexity, while simultaneously maintaining agricultural communities that cultivated barley and wheat across the temperate river valleys and upland regions they inhabited. Yet despite their evident technical sophistication and widespread influence across generations and hundreds of kilometers, the Unetice culture vanished from the archaeological record with surprising abruptness around 1600 BCE, leaving behind settlements that were abandoned, trade routes that fell silent, and communities that either dissolved into successor populations or migrated away, leaving minimal trace of their departure. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with the Unetice disappearance stems from the paradox that advanced technological capability seemingly failed to ensure cultural continuity or survival, challenging our modern assumption that civilization represents an evolutionary arc toward permanence and inevitable progress. We observe that societies demonstrating clear innovation, sophisticated trade networks, and organized labor systems nevertheless collapsed or transformed entirely, yet we persist in studying their material remains. In northeastern Thailand, in a region known as the Mun River Valley, there existed a civilization whose name would eventually become synonymous with one of archaeology's most contentious ethical dilemmas. The Ban Chiang culture flourished during the Bronze Age, roughly between 3600 and 800 BCE, developing a sophisticated society that produced some of Southeast Asia's most distinctive pottery and metalwork. The people of Ban Chiang created intricate vessels decorated with bold geometric patterns and spiral designs, crafted bronze tools and weapons with remarkable skill, and established trade networks that extended across the broader region. Yet this accomplished civilization would eventually vanish from continuous habitation, leaving behind only the material remnants of their achievement. What makes Ban Chiang exceptional in the archaeological record is not merely what they built, but rather what happened to what they left behind. Throughout the 20th century, particularly following initial excavations in the 1970s, Ban Chiang artifacts became extraordinarily desirable in the international antiquities market, transforming a relatively obscure archaeological site into a focal point for looting and clandestine excavation on an unprecedented scale. The psychological mechanism driving this phenomenon operates through a curious inversion of value, wherein objects become increasingly precious precisely because they are rare and threatened, creating a self-reinforcing cycle wherein demand for artifacts directly incentivizes their removal from context and subsequent sale to collectors who view ownership as a form of cultural stewardship. The Thai government and international archaeological community recognized this pattern and moved to protect the site. Yet Ban Chiang artifacts continued appearing in major museums and private collections worldwide, fragmenting the archaeological record so thoroughly that deep within the Yangtze River Valley of ancient China, approximately 8,000 years ago, there existed a remarkable civilization known as the Pengtoushan Culture, named after the archaeological site where its remains were first discovered in Zhejiang province. This culture flourished during the early Neolithic period, representing one of the earliest known rice-cultivating societies in the world, yet today it remains virtually unknown outside academic circles, eclipsed by the more famous Yellow River civilizations that would later dominate Chinese historical narratives. The people of Pengtoushan developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, constructing elaborate pile-dwelling settlements along riverbanks and wetlands where they cultivated rice in deliberately managed paddies, a technological achievement that would fundamentally transform human civilization and feed billions across Asia for millennia to come. Archaeological evidence reveals that these settlements contained wooden structures, tools fashioned from bone and stone, and pottery decorated with distinctive cord-marked patterns, indicating a society with considerable organizational complexity and artistic sensibility. What makes Pengtoushan particularly fascinating is the psychological phenomenon by which early achievements become forgotten once later, more spectacular developments overshadow them, a pattern deeply embedded in how human societies construct historical memory and cultural identity. The Pengtoushan culture gradually transformed into the Bashadang culture and eventually merged into broader Neolithic developments, its distinctive identity dissolving not through catastrophe, but through continuous cultural evolution and absorption. We have normalized this erasure by accepting the standard historical frameworks that privilege written records and monumental architecture over the equally significant but archaeologically quieter achievements of ancient agriculturalists. Between approximately 1500 and 1000 BCE, a seafaring culture emerged across the vast islands of the South Pacific, leaving behind one of archaeology's most intriguing mysteries, the Lapita People, whose distinctive pottery and settlement patterns vanished almost as suddenly as they appeared. These remarkable navigators established themselves across Melanesia and into Polynesia, creating a cultural footprint identifiable through their characteristic dentate-stamped ceramic vessels, which bore geometric patterns and unique design elements that archaeologists recognize across thousands of islands spanning an enormous geographic range. The Lapita people possessed extraordinary maritime capabilities, constructing outrigger canoes and navigating by stars and ocean swells across treacherous waters, settling islands from Fiji to Samoa and beyond, establishing agricultural communities, and developing sophisticated trade networks that connected distant island populations. Yet within several centuries, this distinctive Lapita archaeological signature simply vanished from the record, their pottery styles disappeared, their settlement patterns changed, and the unified cultural identity that defined them dissolved into the diverse populations that would become the Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian peoples we know today. The mechanism behind this disappearance likely reflects not a catastrophic collapse, but rather a natural process of cultural evolution and adaptation. As isolated island communities developed independent identities, modified their material culture in response to local environmental conditions, and gradually diverged from their common ancestry. What makes the Lapita phenomenon psychologically compelling is how completely they vanished despite leaving undeniable evidence of their existence, creating a cultural discontinuity that fascinates researchers, reminding us that even societies with remarkable achievements and between approximately 1300 and 700 BCE, across vast stretches of Central and Eastern Europe, a peculiar funerary practice emerged and spread with remarkable consistency, fundamentally altering how entire populations related to death, the afterlife, and the disposal of their deceased. The Urnfield culture, named for its characteristic practice of cremating the dead and placing their ashes into ceramic vessels that were then buried in designated communal cemeteries, represented a dramatic departure from the earlier Bronze Age burial customs that had dominated Europe for centuries. Where previous cultures had interred whole bodies in carefully constructed tumuli and barrows, the Urnfield peoples reduced their dead to ash through intense heat and contained these remains in small, often decorative pottery containers, clustering thousands of such urns together in orderly, sprawling graveyards that sometimes contained hundreds or even thousands of individual burials. This widespread adoption of cremation, which eventually encompassed regions from the Atlantic coast to the Carpathian Mountains, demonstrated a synchronized shift in religious ideology and practical death management that swept through Bronze Age societies with such efficiency that archaeologists can trace its expansion almost like watching a slow-motion wave rolling across a map of Europe. The psychological mechanism underlying this transformation likely centered on fundamental changes in how these communities conceived of the soul, the afterlife, and humanity's relationship with the physical body, suggesting that cremation may have been understood as a form of purification or transformation that liberated the spiritual essence from material constraints. This unifying practice created a shared cultural and ritual identity across diverse populations who otherwise maintained distinct local traditions in pottery styles, settlement patterns, and economic practices. Yet the Minoan pottery tradition represents one of the most distinctive and chronologically significant ceramic cultures of the Korean peninsula, flourishing from approximately 900 BCE through the 1st century CE. Yet today it remains largely absent from mainstream historical consciousness, despite its profound importance to understanding early East Asian cultural development. This pottery, characterized by its unglazed, hand-formed vessels with thick walls and a distinctive reddish-brown or gray coloration, emerged during the Bronze Age and persisted through the early Iron Age, marking a technological and aesthetic departure from earlier Neolithic ceramics that had dominated the region for millennia. The Minoan people, whose name derives from the Korean term for plain or undecorated pottery, left behind vast archaeological deposits throughout the Korean peninsula, from the southern coast to the northern regions, suggesting a widespread and relatively stable civilization that sustained itself across centuries through agricultural innovation, hunting, and increasingly complex social hierarchies. What makes the Minoan culture particularly fascinating is the psychological dimension of their ceramic choices. rather than embracing the elaborate decorative impulses that characterized pottery traditions elsewhere in contemporary civilizations. The Minoan people deliberately chose functional simplicity, suggesting a cultural worldview that prioritized utility and efficiency over ornamental display as markers of status and identity. This aesthetic philosophy reflected deeper logical mechanisms within their society, where the standardization of vessel forms and the emphasis on practical storage solutions for agricultural surpluses indicated an economy increasingly oriented toward sedentary settlement and resource management rather than nomadic mobility. In the second millennium before the Common Era, across the western coast of what we now call Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, there existed a powerful confederation of city-states and kingdoms collectively known as Arzawa, a civilization that commanded considerable influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean world, yet left behind remarkably few traces of its existence in the archaeological record. The Arzawans were contemporaries of the great Hittite Empire, and historical records indicate they maintained a complex relationship with their more famous neighbors, sometimes engaging in diplomatic relations and occasionally waging brutal wars across their shared borders. Yet despite this prominence in the written records of ancient Near Eastern powers, the material culture and urban centers of Arzawa have proven extraordinarily difficult to locate and definitively identify by modern archaeologists. What we know of Arzawa comes almost entirely from Egyptian and Hittite correspondence, cuneiform tablets that mention Arzawan princes, military campaigns, and trade negotiations, creating a paradoxical situation where a civilization appears extensively documented in foreign archives while its own homeland remains frustratingly elusive to excavation. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon reflects a fundamental challenge in archaeology. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, yet our understanding of ancient civilizations becomes dangerously dependent on the specific records that survived the millennia, whether by chance preservation or the deliberate archival practices of neighboring powers. Arzawa seemingly vanished not through a single catastrophic collapse, but through a gradual process of cultural fragmentation, absorption, and the eventual loss of literacy or centralized administration that would have preserved its own written history. Between the 8th and 15th centuries, a remarkable network of city-states flourished along the East African coast, from present-day Somalia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, creating one of the Indian Ocean's most sophisticated trading civilizations. These Swahili city-states, including Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and Lamu, emerged as prosperous maritime centers where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants converged to trade gold, ivory, spices, and enslaved people, generating immense wealth that manifested in stone architecture, intricate poetry, and a cosmopolitan Islamic culture that distinguished them from inland African societies. The name Swahili itself derives from the Arabic word for coast, reflecting how these settlements positioned themselves as bridges between continental Africa and the wider Islamic world, developing their own distinctive language and culture that blended Bantu linguistic foundations with Arabic vocabulary and Islamic traditions. Archaeological evidence and historical records reveal that these city-states operated as independent political entities, each governed by sultans or merchant princes who accumulated power through control of trade networks rather than territorial expansion, creating a system where commercial success translated directly into political authority and cultural influence. The psychological mechanism underlying their prominence rested on the fundamental human impulse to exploit geographic advantage. Their coastal positions made them natural intermediaries, and merchants naturally gravitated toward locations where they could exchange goods with minimal friction. Yet this very success created vulnerabilities that history would exploit. By the 16th century, Portuguese naval expansion into the Indian Ocean systematically disrupted these established trade routes, establishing military dominance that undermined the economic foundations upon which Swahili prosperity depend. Deep in the Shanxi province of northern China, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a sophisticated ancient settlement called Shimao that flourished during the late Neolithic period, approximately 5,000 years ago, yet vanished so completely from historical records that its existence remained entirely unknown to the modern world until systematic excavations began in the early 21st century. The site reveals a remarkably complex society featuring massive defensive walls constructed from rammed earth and stone, suggesting a civilization sufficiently advanced to organize large-scale construction projects and defend against external threats, with evidence of elaborate ceremonial areas, sophisticated pottery production, and a social hierarchy that indicates centralized authority and specialized labor divisions. The archaeological record demonstrates that Shimao's inhabitants possessed agricultural knowledge, crafted intricate jade artifacts of extraordinary quality, maintained trade networks extending across considerable distances, and developed artistic and spiritual practices reflected in their burial customs and ritual objects. Yet this thriving civilization appears to have been abandoned relatively suddenly around 4,800 years ago, leaving behind only silent ruins that would remain hidden beneath accumulated earth and vegetation for millennia. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with Shimao stems from a fundamental human compulsion to understand how advanced societies simply cease to exist, how knowledge systems and cultural traditions can be entirely erased from collective memory, and how the physical evidence of human achievement can be swallowed by time and nature so thoroughly that entire populations become ghosts existing only in the archaeological record. Between approximately 1300 and 800 BCE, across the vast steppes and river valleys of southern Siberia, a distinctive Bronze Age culture flourished and then disappeared almost entirely from the archaeological record, leaving behind only fragmented evidence of its existence and prompting scholars to question whether we truly understand the mechanisms by which ancient societies transform and vanish. The Karasuk culture, named after the Karasuk River in the Minusinsk Basin, represents one of the most enigmatic transitions in prehistoric Eurasian history, emerging from earlier Andronovo traditions, yet developing its own unmistakable characteristics, including distinctive burial practices, bronze metallurgy techniques, and settlement patterns that suggest a society caught between pastoral nomadism and sedentary village life. What makes the Karasuk disappearance particularly puzzling is that unlike civilizations buried by catastrophic events or foreign conquest, the Karasuk people seem to have gradually transformed into successor cultures, their genetic and cultural material dispersing across the steppes in ways that obscure any clear continuity or dramatic endpoint. Archaeological evidence reveals that Karasuk societies organized themselves in small, mobile communities scattered across river valleys where they combined herding with seasonal hunting and fishing, yet simultaneously maintained craft specialization and long-distance trade networks that suggest organizational complexity beyond simple pastoral bands. The psychological mechanism underlying our confusion about such societies relates to our deeply ingrained expectation that civilizations should present clear, dramatic narratives with distinct beginnings and endings, heroes and villains, prosperity followed by catastrophic collapse, when in reality many ancient peoples simply adapted slowly to changing climates, gradually mixed with neighboring populations or deliberat. The Hongshan culture emerged in northeastern China during the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, flourishing across the Liaoning province and surrounding regions with a sophistication that challenges our understanding of early civilizations in East Asia. This remarkable society developed intricate jade-working techniques, constructed massive earthen ceremonial platforms, and created distinctive pottery that reveals a deep spiritual worldview centered on shamanism and ancestor veneration. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Hongshan people possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, constructed elaborate ritual sites aligned with celestial events, and maintained trade networks that extended across vast distances, indicating an organized society capable of coordinating complex activities across multiple settlements and generations. Yet despite these undeniable markers of cultural achievement and social organization, the Hongshan culture underwent a dramatic transformation and eventual decline around 3,000 years before the present, gradually giving way to successor cultures and eventually fading from historical memory for millennia until modern archaeological recovery began unveiling its secrets in the 20th century. The psychological mechanism underlying how such an advanced civilization could vanish from conscious historical knowledge relates to the discontinuity of cultural transmission and the fragmentation of archaeological evidence across time, wherein catastrophic environmental changes, population migrations, or shifts in cultural identity can effectively erase the continuity that allows societies to maintain historical narratives and collective memory across generations. We have normalized this disappearance by compartmentalizing the Hongshan culture within academic archaeological discourse, rather than recognizing it as a formative influence on subsequent East Asian civilizations, allowing a foundational coup. Deep within the steppes of southern Russia, near the Ural Mountains, lies one of archaeology's most puzzling enigmas: the Sanxingdui culture, a Bronze Age civilization that flourished around 3200 to 1500 BCE before vanishing almost without trace from the historical record. The Sanxingdui people, whose name derives from the river valley where their remains were discovered, constructed elaborate settlements featuring intricate defensive fortifications arranged in geometric patterns that suggested both sophisticated urban planning and an acute awareness of external threats that would fundamentally shape their society. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remnants of their distinctive chariots, the earliest known examples of wheeled vehicles designed specifically for warfare, along with evidence of advanced metalworking techniques, domesticated horses, and a surprisingly complex social hierarchy that distinguished warriors, craftspeople, and common laborers within their communities. Yet despite these remarkable achievements and the undeniable sophistication of their material culture, the Sanxingdui civilization appears to have contracted dramatically, with their settlements abandoned and their cultural practices absorbed or replaced by successor populations moving across the steppes. The mechanism behind their disappearance likely involved a combination of environmental catastrophe, possibly severe climate fluctuations that transformed grasslands into arid wasteland, coupled with the emergence of more mobile pastoral groups who possessed superior military technology and tactical advantages that rendered fixed settlements increasingly vulnerable to conquest and displacement. The Sanxingdui left no written records to document their own decline, no monuments proclaiming their achievements or explaining their withdrawal from prominence, which means their story exists only in the fragmentary archaeological evidence of pottery. Deep within the Amazon basin, on the island of Marajo at the mouth of the Amazon River, there flourished between roughly 800 and 1500 CE a sophisticated civilization whose achievements rivaled those of contemporary societies elsewhere in the world, yet whose name has become little more than a whisper in the corridors of archaeological study. The Marajora people constructed an elaborate society on what many assumed was inhospitable wetland terrain, developing complex systems of agricultural production, monumental architecture, and artistic expression that demonstrated remarkable engineering prowess and social organization. They created massive earthworks and raised platforms that allowed them to thrive in seasonally flooded environments, fashioned intricate pottery adorned with distinctive geometric patterns and anthropomorphic designs, and established trade networks that extended across considerable distances through the river systems of South America. The archaeological evidence reveals a hierarchical society with distinct social classes, specialized craftspeople, and evidence of ritual practices that suggest sophisticated spiritual and cosmological understanding. Yet despite these undeniable accomplishments, the Marajora civilization contracted and ultimately disappeared from the historical record around the time of European contact, their cities reclaimed by jungle and their cultural practices absorbed or extinguished through disease, conflict, and demographic collapse. The psychological mechanism behind our historical amnesia regarding the Marajora reflects a broader scholarly bias that has long directed attention toward more visible or geographically accessible civilizations, combined with the simple reality that tropical environments destroy material evidence far more rapidly than arid regions do. Deep within the Caribbean islands, particularly across what we now call Puerto Rico and the surrounding archipelago, there existed a civilization that constructed elaborate ceremonial plazas and sculpted stone figures with a sophistication that rivaled many contemporary cultures across the globe. Yet their name and true identity have been almost entirely absorbed into the historical shadows cast by later colonial narratives. The Zemi builders, as modern archaeologists have designated them, created monumental Beatty plazas, large rectangular ceremonial grounds bordered by carefully placed stones and mounds, which served as the spiritual and social centers of their communities, hosting ritual ball games, religious ceremonies, and gatherings that reinforced the complex social hierarchies that defined their society. These structures, some measuring hundreds of feet in length, required extraordinary coordination engineering knowledge, and communal labor, yet they have been relegated to footnotes in historical texts, overshadowed by the indigenous groups who occupied these lands centuries later. The psychological mechanism behind their erasure appears rooted in the colonial reimagining of Caribbean history, where earlier civilizations were simply absorbed into broader categories rather than recognized as distinct peoples with their own achievements and trajectories. European chroniclers and later historians found it simpler to frame Caribbean indigenous peoples as monolithic entities rather than acknowledge the successive waves of settlement, cultural development, and civilization building that had occurred across centuries. What makes this erasure particularly striking is that the evidence remains literally visible across the landscape. The Beatty plazas still stand in certain locations, the stone zemi figures still exist in museums, and archaeological records document their material culture with remarkable detail, yet we have normalized their invisibility. Deep within the Minusinsk basin of southern Siberia, between the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era, a peculiar and sophisticated culture emerged from the archaeological record with characteristics so distinctive and isolated that its very existence challenges our understanding of prehistoric development in Central Asia. The Okhinev culture, named after the site where it was first identified, flourished for roughly 1,000 years before vanishing almost entirely from the historical landscape, leaving behind only cryptic monuments and burial practices that suggest a society far more complex than the sparse remaining evidence would initially indicate. The people of this culture constructed elaborate stone burial mounds, or kurgans, within which they placed their dead alongside intricate carved slates bearing geometric patterns and enigmatic representations of human faces and supernatural beings, objects that appear to serve religious or shamanic purposes, yet whose true meaning remains fundamentally obscure to modern researchers. These grave goods, particularly the distinctive slate tablets and carved idols, display an artistic sophistication and spiritual complexity that implies a highly organized society with established religious hierarchies and ritualistic practices, suggesting people who possess not merely survival skills, but elaborate cosmological beliefs and artistic traditions worthy of monumental effort. The culture appears to have supported itself through a combination of herding, hunting, and possibly early pastoral agriculture, maintaining settlements that, while modest by later standards, demonstrate evidence of permanent or semi-permanent occupation and social stratification, visible in the differentiation of burial goods and the scale of individual monuments. Between roughly 2,000 years ago and 1,600 years ago, across the vast river valleys of North America, a sophisticated cultural network flourished and then vanished almost without trace, leaving behind only the mysterious earthworks and burial mounds that still puzzle archaeologists today. The Hopewell people, named after a farm in Ohio where their artifacts were first discovered, represented not a single unified empire, but rather a far-flung trade network and cultural exchange system that connected disparate communities across thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, binding them through shared ceremonial practices, artistic styles, and religious beliefs that transcended geographical boundaries. These remarkable people engineered massive geometric earthworks, some spanning hundreds of feet across, constructed elaborate burial mounds containing intricate grave goods made from materials sourced from distant regions, and produced distinctive artwork that demonstrated an advanced understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and spiritual symbolism that still astounds modern scholars. The psychological mechanism that unified the Hopewell appears to have been rooted in a sophisticated belief system centered on cosmology and the afterlife, where elaborate funerary practices served not merely as expressions of reverence for the dead, but as binding rituals that reinforced the interconnectedness of scattered communities and reaffirmed their shared cultural identity across vast distances. Yet by the 6th century, this entire complex civilization began to fragment and decline. The great earthworks fell into disrepair, the long-distance trade networks collapsed, and the distinctive Hopewell cultural practices gradually disappeared as local populations returned to more autonomous settlement patterns and different religious frameworks. In the rolling steppes of northern Kazakhstan, archaeologists have uncovered the remnants of one of humanity's most pivotal, yet mysteriously abandoned cultures, the Batai, a civilization that flourished approximately 5,000 years ago and then vanished from the historical record almost entirely. The Batai people, whose name derives from the archaeological site where they were first systematically studied, established settlements across the Eurasian steppe during the 4th millennium before the Common Era, leaving behind extensive evidence of a sophisticated society centered around a practice that would fundamentally transform human civilization: the domestication and intensive exploitation of horses. What makes the Batai particularly enigmatic is not merely their sudden disappearance, but the peculiar contradiction between their historical significance and their almost complete erasure from collective memory and mainstream historical consciousness. The Batai developed the world's first genuine horse-herding culture, domesticating these powerful animals on a massive scale and creating an economic and social system entirely dependent upon equine resources. Yet this monumental achievement remained virtually unknown to the modern world until recent decades of archaeological investigation brought their contributions to light. These Bronze Age communities demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in their material culture, producing distinctive pottery with geometric patterns, crafting bone and antler implements of exceptional refinement, and building semi-permanent settlements that housed populations sustained through the systematic breeding and management of horse herds numbering in the thousands. The psychological mechanism underlying our collective forgetting of such civilizations operates through a form of historical erasure, wherein cultures lacking written language systems become systematically deprioritized in academic discourse and popular knowledge.